On the black scorched earth lay the corpse of a guy with blonde hair. His eyes were rolled up. Abrasions were visible on his face. Blood was dripping from his lips. The man's clothes were torn. Red sparks were flying in the air next to him. The main character thought that in the end everyone died. A man in a black glove with open fingers was holding a red crystal in his hand, which was cracked. There were fragments of stones next to his hand, and there was a pool of blood under his hand. A guy with black hair was lying on cracked stones, looking at his hand, in which a red crystal had dissolved, leaving behind stripes of red energy. The man's pale face was all blood. He looked up with dull eyes. 2 bloody stripes came from his mouth. Blood completely filled his left eye. His clothes were torn, and an iron beam stained with blood was visible in the man's chest. The main character thought that even he, the one whom everyone calls the strongest warrior, is about to die, and he is truly unworthy of the title of the strongest. Around the guy with black hair, there were many bodies of dead monsters. Bright red sparks were flying in the air. He thought that he only realized this now, even after killing all the 7th rank demons. The guy squeezed the ground with his bloody hand, leaving marks on it. His fingers trembled. He asked why. Leaning on one of the stones, the main character raised his trembling body to sit down. He lowered his head, asking why there were demons of the 8th rank in the Guvan obelisk. A huge demon, hidden in a shadow, appeared above the guy who was sitting on the ground. He smiled. The wind blew around him. In the distance, another demon with red skin and wings descended from the sky. The main character thought that humanity had no idea about the power of demons, and it was all because of him. He opened his mouth, from which drops of blood flew out. Blood also flowed from the edge of his lips. Tangled black hair fell onto his face. He thought that he had betrayed his title of the strongest. A demon with red horns among long blonde hair and yellow bright eyes. Her face was hidden in shadow. Breathing heavily, the main character looked up at him, realizing that he was up to something. The demon took off on his wings in front of the main character, causing a powerful stream of wind to swirl around them. The guy clenched his teeth. The demon with long blonde hair extended his red hand forward, with sharp claws. The main character thought that he had killed many of them, and that is why they want to tear him to pieces. The protagonist's eyes closed when the demon extended his hand closer to him. The demon's bright yellow eye was visible from under his fingers. The main character's eyes closed. He thought about the dark, and this is what death means. Suddenly he thought about the light. In the distance a golden ball was visible, which cast a bright golden light from itself. A bright golden light filled the entire space. The commander shouted for the new guys to get in line. A lot of guys in black boots and green pants. The protagonist's yellow eyes widened in shock, and he opened them wide. A young guy with short black hair and pale skin. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back. His eyes widened, his mouth parted in surprise. He looked around, standing in a large, bright hall, with many people in the same clothes. Mentally, the guy asked where he was and hadn't he died. The main character raised his hand, looking at it in surprise, and thought that this doesn't look like a dream and everything seems so real. What happened? The guy cupped his face in his hands, put his hand to his chin, feeling his face. He pressed his hands to his face. There were many waves behind him as he screamed that this was not his face, and where was his manly, handsome face and toned body? He raised his head, looking up with wide open eyes, and mentally asked who he was. A large hall where a group of people stood. The main character wondered where he was. A large gray building with yellow and black tape on the floor visible on the roof. The city of Helios, a huge city with 4 towers inside and many small houses, which was surrounded by a wall. A man in black clothes, light blonde hair and a light beard stood in front of many soldiers, with his hands behind his back. He loudly asked if they knew what it meant to pass the test of war. The man had yellow eyes. He frowned, looking at the soldiers with a serious gaze, shouting if they knew what it meant to be a warrior. And they were the embodiment of protection and hope. The 3rd captain of Helios, Jai Yeadang. There were fragments of stones, blood stains were visible, smoke and red sparks were flying in the air. The captain said that one day in 3069, 6 huge obelisks of Guan fell from the sky, and from that day their world came to an end. A huge dragon with 2 heads, who opened his wide mouth, sticking out his tongue. The man above him shouted, raising his hand. A monster with purple skin and no eyes stuck out its tongue, jumping onto the arch. People were running away from it. Several monsters stood over a man who was covered in blood. One of them put his paw on his face, and the second was devouring the man. The green monster loomed over the man, who clenched his teeth. His body was covered in blood, saliva dripping from the monster's mouth. People looked up in panic, looking at the monster that was sitting on the red wall. A huge purple monster with a black head was running after the girl, stretching out its paw. Jai Yaedeng said that creatures they call demons fell from the obelisks. They mercilessly killed everyone around them. Scientists in white coats, blue masks and hats stood at the apparatus to which a demon with purple skin was chained. Above him there was a device that opened his flesh, giving access to the red heart. Many wires were connected to the monster. The man continued that humanity, after a fierce battle that almost led them to extinction, they developed a way to fight demons. A red crystal was fixed to the panel, to which a tool was placed, which threw yellow sparks away from itself, a crossing technique. The demon, who had a crystal in his chest, had arrows leading from him, showing the crystal from a person, and the crystal arrows were leading towards each other down, showing a man with a red device in his chest, around which there was red energy. Jai Yaedeng said that the technique uses the extracted from the body of demons is a core that allows people to undergo interbreeding and temporarily take possession of power comparable to that of a demon. A man with black long hair and yellow eyes, a red pattern was visible on his forehead, and a red light was emanating from his body. Jai Yaedeng said that 60 years ago, the greatest and strongest warrior of mankind, this warrior was revered by everyone as if he was a king. On the shore near the sea, before dawn, Aang held a red sword, clenching his teeth. Next to him were many warriors in black clothes and red cloaks. In their hands there were weapons that glowed in different colors. A crowd of demons was coming towards the warriors. Some opened with their mouths hanging out, some holding weapons in their hands. The captain said that Aang led other warriors in an attack against the strongest wave of demons. A man with black hair jumped over one of the demons, holding a sword in his hand. His red cloak was torn, his eyes were glowing with a red light. Behind him was another huge demon. Under the guy other warriors were fighting with the demons. The captain continued that the offensive lasted for several weeks so that the sky turned black. Dark fog and red sparks were flying around. Weapons were stuck into the ground. The dead bodies of soldiers and demons lay on the ground. Jai Yaedeng said that in the end the warriors repelled the onslaught of the demons, and those who remained were very weak, so there was a lull for 60 years. The main character's eyes widened as he listened to the story. He realized that it was 60 years ago, and he was reborn 60 years into the future. The captain lowered his gaze. Frowning, he said that at the same time, they had forever lost a huge number of great and brave warriors. The main character in his old body stood on the bodies of the killed demons. Behind him was a bright big moon. A torn red cloak fluttered in the wind. He leaned on one of the swords, with his head down. The captain continued that they had lost Aang, who was once called the most strong warrior of humanity, and it is said that he fell in battle with several demons of the highest 7th rank. The figure of Aang, hidden in shadow, stood on the mountain. The sky darkened. Weapons were stuck into the ground everywhere. Next to one of the swords lay a device with a red crystal inside. Jai Yaedeng said that this great battle between humans and demons showed that humanity will stand to the death, and would definitely see a new dawn, so it became known as the Battle of Dawn. The black-haired guy's eyes widened as he remembered the demons that descended from the sky. He thought that the highest rank of demons was not the 7th, but the 8th, and although not exactly, he began to understand that humanity still does not know until now about the real power of demons. The captain with a warlike face raised his hand, clenched it into a fist, and shouted that if it weren't for those warriors, they wouldn't exist now, and if it weren't for these warriors, they wouldn't have seen their usual life at home. He waved his hand, standing in front of a crowd of soldiers who stood with their heads raised, hands behind their backs. The man shouted that this is what their desire to protect people and give hope means. Jai Yaedeng loudly asked if they now understood what it meant to be a warrior. The soldiers frowned, looking at the captain with wide eyes, and shouted that yes. The man heard someone muttering the word no. He frowned and turned his gaze towards the man. The main character lowered his head, muttering something under his breath about demons and rank. The captain headed towards the main character. The soldiers next to whom he passed shuddered. The man stood over the guy, casting a large shadow on him. He said that it seems the main character does not understand what it means to be a warrior. Aang looked at the man in surprise. The captain smiled, his golden eyes shining as he looked down at the boy, asking him to tell him his name. Aang looked at him, stuttering and trying to say something. He wondered if he should reveal that he was Aang. The main character wondered if anyone could believe that he was Aang, who had moved here 60 years into the future, on the verge between life and death. Jai Yaedeng looked away from the guy and said that who would have thought that they could easily abuse a great name like that. The main character looked in surprise at his t-shirt, where the white fabric was embroidered with a blue inscription, "The Tested Warrior Aang." Jai Yaedeng said that who would have thought that he was the namesake of the great warrior Aang. The man put his hand on the guy's shoulder, looking away, and said that he was a fool and he wasn't even in the clothes of a warrior. The hand on the young man's shoulder clenched and trembled, telling him not to allow himself to insult such a great name. The captain hit Aang sharply in the face, waving his hand widely. His face was distorted with anger. He shouted that this was a disgrace. The guy with black hair flew back. There was a red mark on his cheek from the blow. Drops of blood flew out of his mouth. The main character thought that he was still in this weak body and could not even dodge such an attack. But this body simply had the same name as his. Aang fell back, stretching his arms forward. One of the soldiers extended his arms towards him, leaning towards him. The soldier kept his hand on the back of Aang, who was sitting on the floor. The captain turned to him with a displeased look and said that during the next test of the warrior, he would watch him closely. Passing by the soldiers, the captain loudly asked if everyone had heard this. They, without changing their position and looking forward, answered in agreement. The captain told them to go to the test site. The man stood in front of the exit of the hall with his back to the soldiers. There was a bright white light outside the exit. Jai Yadeng said that the physical test was beginning. One of the soldiers kept his hands on the shoulders of the main character, who was lying on the floor, hugging him. He asked if the guy was okay. He replied that he was still alive. Lan Sinuo, cadet, a guy with dark blonde hair and brown eyes, smiled at the main character, saying that his name is indeed Aang. And this is an unusual name. He introduced himself, saying that they would be familiar. A girl among the other soldiers put her hand on her hip, looking at them, and asked how dare he take the name Aang. The two guys looked at her. A girl with long white hair and blue eyes looked at them over her shoulder, calling the main character a stupid boy. She said that he really thought that if they had the same names, he would become just as strong. Sidu Liu cadet. She waved her hand, causing her white hair to fly into the air, and turning away, she walked forward, saying that the guy was naive. Aang clenched his teeth, looking after her angrily. He irritably asked why she was so arrogant and why did she care what his name was. Lan Sinuo looked after the girl, asking if he didn't know her, and she might be the most promising cadet in their group. The girl with white hair stood with her back to them, heading out of the room. The guy said that Sidu Liu, also called the Cold-Blooded Demon, the most famous martial arts clan in Helios, Lady Sidu's clan. Aang frowned, looking after the girl with yellow eyes. He thought about Sidu, and for some reason this surname seems familiar to him. Lan Sinuo helped the main character get up from the floor, holding his arm with both hands, and he stood up, thanking the guy. Two guys standing nearby were blinded by a bright white flash of light, and their eyes widened in surprise. A girl with pink hair approached them, holding a camera in her hands, and said what a charming manifestation of male friendship they had. The two turned to look at her. A girl with pink short hair and green eyes held a camera in front of her face with a smile, telling them not to pay attention to her and to continue. Aang looked at the girl with a serious face, frowning. Blood flowed from his nose when he asked the girl's name with a calm face. Lan Sinuo pointed down at the camera she was holding and asked if she had taken a photo of them. She looked down at him and answered positively. Aang clenched his hand into a fist, shouting that he was focusing on the wrong thing. The girl with pink hair smiled widely, looking up at the guy, and said that her name was Suiju Yaohui and it was nice to meet them. Fantasy Suiju Yaohui. Lan Sinuo was holding Aang in his arms. There was a rose in his mouth. A guy with black hair looked at his friend excitedly, hugging his neck. There were white flowers around them. Suiju Yaohui stood in the corner, blushing and holding a camera in front of her face. The girl said that she was struck by their strong male friendship, and it was very attractive. She looked at the screen of her camera, laughing and blushing, giggling and saying that they turned out to be good photos. The two guys looked at her in confusion. Aang said that it was a pity that she was stupid. The location of the physical test, a large green field with a red running track. Next to it stood a group of soldiers and several other people. Aang smiled. His black hair was disheveled. He hit his fist on his palm, thinking that with this new body he was still the strongest warrior. The other soldiers looked at him in confusion, while the guy thought that how could they discuss in front of him who a warrior is in this funny, and once they see its great results, they will be blown away. The main character and other soldiers knelt down with their hands on the ground on the treadmill. In front of them, a man in a white and red t-shirt and red pants raised the starting pistol high above him, shouting that this is the first test, a test of physical fitness, an endurance race. He fired a blank pistol into the sky and shouted march. Aang rushed from his seat. A stripe of light emanated from his golden eyes. He held his hand in front of him, thinking that now he would take first place and at the same time set a record. He really set a record. Aang walked to the finish line on shaky legs, breathing heavily, while the other soldiers laughed at him. The man in the red suit put his hands behind his back, shouting that he had the last place and he broke the record for the worst performance in history. The main character fell face down on the ground, sticking out his tongue, standing next to him. The other soldiers pointed at him and laughed. He thought that this body and everything was too terrible. He couldn't believe it. The second physical test, a test of arm muscles. Aang stood on one trembling knee in front of a device with a smooth black surface. Next to him a man in a red uniform shouted that he was in last place. The other soldiers looked at him in confusion. The guy held his wrist, red remained on his hand mark, and he threw his head back in pain, thinking that he had sprained his wrist. The third physical test, long jump. Sidu Liu looked at the main character, who smiled awkwardly, spreading his arms to the sides. The arrow next to the girl showed 2 meters from the start. The arrow next to the guy showed 1 meter from the start. The girl with white hair turned away, throwing her white hair back and crossing her arms over her chest, closing her eyes, saying that he was stupid. Aang grabbed his head. His eyes went white with shock and he opened his mouth wide, falling to his knees. When someone said that the test was over and he was last in the overall standings, the guy shouted that this was the worst result in history and he would be kicked out. Aang fell to his knees, clenching his hands into fists. A dramatic light fell on him. Lan Sinuo sat next to him on one knee, smiling awkwardly and sighing, scratching the back of his head. Suiju Yaohui took pictures of them, thinking that this was the last time she would take pictures of them together. A man in a white and red t-shirt pointed his finger at the guy, approaching Jai Yeodan, asking if Aang passes to the second stage of the test, and for such a terrible test he can be immediately kicked out. The captain shook his head, closed his eyes and gritted his teeth, saying that although his results were hopeless, he had the right to participate in the second stage of the test, and he thought that this would be his last. A man walked past a guy in a white and red suit and clenched his hands into fists, telling him to begin the second stage of the test. The guy flinched and put his hands behind his back, shouting that he understood the order. A large gramophone on a pole, from which a voice was heard that announced the beginning of the second stage. And the second stage of the test, a test for compatibility with the crossing technique. Aang rested his hands on his knees, looking up in surprise when he heard the announcement. The protagonist smiled when he heard about the crossbreeding technique compatibility test. A voice from a gramophone in the distance announced that they were asking all participating cadets to proceed to the test site. Aang stood on the treadmill, hunched over, and thought that in the crossbreeding compatibility test he had a chance. He remembered his previous body. The man was smiling. His golden eyes were glowing, and in his chest there was a device with a red crystal. Nearby it showed 96%. The guy thought that 60 years ago he had a better synchronization level, about 96%. He clenched his trembling hand into a fist. A fire appeared in his yellow eyes when he thought that physically this body is so-so. But synchronization depends on willpower, and in this squad everyone makes fun of him. But he will see who will laugh last. Clenching his hands into fists, Aang walked forward, his golden eyes glowing and a translucent mist coming from the guy. The other cadets looked at him while the guy thought that he would show them what the synchronization level of the strongest warrior looks like. Many people stood in a large hall. In front of them there was a platform where a couple of people stood near some kind of device. Next to it was a blue screen. Aang looked at the black turtleneck he was wearing. There was a round device on the chest of the clothes. He said in surprise that this is how crossbreeding happens in the future and it will be easier. One of the cadets stood on the platform. Various wires were reaching towards him. The checker on the platform said that the synchronization level was 39%. The other cadets looked at the venue, saying that it was worthy, and the highest rate was only 39%. The checker shouted that the test was passed. One of the cadets said that this must be the best result this year, and the martial arts clans have completely different results. Sidu Liu stood on the platform. Many wires were connected to her body. The thickest wire stretched from her chest, from which came bright green light. The girl looked down at the green light that illuminated her face, beads of sweat flowing down it. Sidu Liu is a cold-blooded demon. The cadet boys with reddened cheeks looked at the girl, asking out loud how they could get a girl like her and the fact that she really started to glow. Aang next to them looked at them displeasedly and thought that they were victims of puberty. A huge wire fell away from the girl's chest, which now contained a bright green crystal. She snorted and walked away from the platform, throwing her white hair back with her eyes closed. Sidu Liu walked down the stairs while other cadets said that she was worthy of the title of this year's strongest recruit. Someone said that Sidu Liu is from a martial arts clan and they say that she has been training a lot since childhood. The girl walked towards the large sliding doors. A white light came from the opening. Someone said that she just has talent and you need to try as hard as you can and take first place. Someone said that with her hair down it suits her. Another said that she from a good clan, has a lot of potential, looks good, and they're really just there to create the appearance of numbers. The automatic doors slammed behind the girl. The sign above said recreation room. One of the cadets said that this was a downright unattainable skill level. Sidu Liu exhaled loudly, her cheeks turning red. She pressed her back against the automatic door, clenching her hand into a fist. The girl puffed out her cheeks, thinking that she had a good result, 39%, and everyone saw it. She definitely made an impression. The girl waved her hands in front of her, trying to cool down her reddened face, and looked back, saying that even though she didn't care that she had so many fans, it was still exciting, and she needed to calm down and not worry. Aang put his hand to his face and raised an eyebrow, thinking that was impressive. He said that during the test she managed to achieve 39% synchronization. Lan Sinuo patted the guy on the shoulder with his elbow and smiled, leaning towards him, saying that Sidu Liu is strong in body. He looked forward with a smile, saying that she was strong in spirit and he could feel this power in her petite body. Aang frowned and closed his eyes and said that he also felt that she was strong. Lan Sinuo put his hand on the guy's shoulder, looking at him, and said that he was not worried at all. The main character put his hands on his waist and closed his eyes, said that everything was fine and he was used to it. The guy next to him raised his eyebrows in surprise, asking about what he was used to. During the test, many cadets who first encountered the crossing technique often experience pain. The bald man closed one eye connected to many wires. The veins on his head swelled. A yellow light shone from the wire connected to his chest, and 9% was shown nearby, 10%, 12%. The guy fell on the floor of the platform, breathing heavily and trembling. The inspector looked at the tablet, shouting that the synchronization level was 12%, and the test was passed. Behind him on the huge screen it also showed 12%. When you go through crossing for the first time, the body tenses up a lot. You need to withstand the force emanating from the demon core. Some can't stand the pain and give up. The girl with pink hair threw her head back while many wires were connected to her body. She closed her eyes, screaming that she was giving up. Next to her was an inspector with a tablet in his hands. The required synchronization level is 10%. This is all that is needed to pass the test. Lan Sinuo stood connected to the wires, clenched his hands into fists. A yellow light emanated from his chest. Checking the one standing next to him, shouted that the synchronization level was 24%, and the test was passed. Of course, the results of some were unexpected. Suiju Yaohui was connected to many wires. She looked at the thick wire that was emitting blue light. Her face turned red and she was breathing heavily. The tester shouted that the synchronization level was 30%, and the test was passed. Two silhouettes of a person could be seen outside the windows, observing the test site. Jai Yaedeng crossed his arms over his chest with a smile as he watched and said that there were several promising cadets this time. A girl in a white dress, with blonde hair tied in a bun, and pink eyes, was holding a white tablet in her hands. Looking at it, she agreed, saying that now including Suiju Yaohui, she said that this time there are already 6 cadets in the test, whose synchronization level has reached 30% or higher. The girl looked up, smiling and saying that compared to other C-class cities, their cadets were quite good. Jai Yaedeng frowned, looking forward with his yellow eyes, and hummed thoughtfully. The man looked down at the group of candidates, crossed his arms over his chest, and replied that there were some who were not very good. Aang headed towards the stairs leading to the platform. He kneaded his shoulder, placing his hand on it, and looked up, smiling. The guy was climbing the stairs while other cadets were looking at him with smiles, saying that this was the same Aang, and with such physiology he would probably vomit blood from the load. Another cadet laughed and said that this was the fool who was in last place in all tests at the previous stage. The guy stepped onto the platform, his face hidden in shadow as he thought, let them laugh, and they've never seen anything like this before. A vein swelled on the main character's cheek. He clenched his teeth, frowning and smiling. He thought that they should hold on and it was his turn. The guy approached the device, behind which there was a man. There were 4 crystals of different colors on the device. Pointing to the red crystal, the guy said that he was choosing it. The cores they receive on the battlefield are divided into 6 types. A man wearing yellow gloves carefully removed the red core from the iron stand. Among the nuclei, the four most common are red, yellow, green, and blue, a circle on which different colors were indicated. Red represents strength. A clenched fist was depicted on the red segment. Yellow is protection. On the yellow segment there is a shield with a cross. Green has healing properties. A green cross was depicted on the green segment. Blue is agility. A blue boot was depicted on the blue segment. A purple crystal, behind which there were white eyes, from which violet energy emanated. A black crystal, behind which there was a blue cube with a white clock inside. A purple core, responsible for the skill of managing illusions, and a black one, taking the function of managing time and space, are extremely rare, and the black core is the rarest. Aang stood on the platform, connected to the wires. He held a red crystal in his hand, looking at it. He said that they were starting synchronization. The guy inserted a red crystal into the connector, from which a blue spark emitted. Thin blades came out of the device on the suit, and the main character looked at them, thinking that the most important thing is willpower. The blades dug into the guy's chest. Where they stuck, veins were visible under the suit. Aang's body, which was translucent, the threads of the nervous system were visible, which were indicated in yellow. Red sparks passed from the chest through the body. The guy thought that willpower determines how much load from the demon's core he can endure, or rather, how much he can subjugate the core. The protagonist frowned, pursing his lips, the red core on his chest glowing red. The crossing had begun. One of the employees brought a thick wire to the guy, asking if he was ready. Aang answered positively. Recreation room. Several cadets were standing in the room. A bright red light was shining from the window. Sidu Liu turned back at the red light in surprise, thinking about how strong the impact was. The girl looked at the main character, who stood on the platform. A bright red light emanated from his chest. Other cadets looked at him. She realized that it was from him. Aang pushed his chest forward. His face was illuminated by a bright red light. The veins on his face and neck stood out, and he frowned, thinking that if they all looked at him, he would show them the synchronization level of the strongest warrior. Lan Sinuo, Sidu Liu, and Suiju Yaohui looked at the guy standing next to the window. The guy smiled, saying that he was not so easy. Suiju Yaohui held the camera in front of her face. On the large screen next to the platform, the value 40 was displayed. One of the inspectors looked at it in shock. The other looked at the tablet, shouting that the synchronization level continued to increase, and it instantly reached 40%. Aang smiled, thinking about 40% and the fact that at one time he achieved 96% synchronization. The guy spread his arms, raising them while there was a wire near his chest that glowed red. He bent over, raising his hands and clenching his teeth, his eyes glowing red, dark sparks of energy emanating from the guy's body. He thought he could give out more wires that were connected to the guy. They were illuminated by a red light, and red lightning could be seen around them. The rest of the cadets stepped back, looking at the guy who was surrounded by red lightning and a bright red light. The checkers nearby also looked at him in shock. The panel added percentages. It showed 45%, 50%, and then 60%. The man hit the glass sharply with his palm, causing cracks to appear on it. Jai Yedeng held his palm at the place where the glass cracked. He asked in shock, "What is this? And how is such a high level of synchronization even possible? Is it really some kind of mistake?" The girl nearby was holding a tablet in her hands, looking in confusion at the test site. She said, which is still increasing, 65, 70, 80%. Other cadets with cannonballs in their chests looked at this trembling. A bright red light was shining on them. One of the guys asked in shock what tricks he was performing. The girl covered her face with her hands and closed her eyes, shouting that maybe it was a system error. Aang spread his arms to the sides while a bright red light emanated from him. The rest of the cadets looked at him in shock, closed their eyes, or ran forward in panic. The main character thought that he should be revered like a king, because he is the strongest warrior of Aang. And if this core wasn't so lousy, and if the body wasn't so weak, he could have brought them all to their knees. The guy smiled, opening his golden eyes. A red light shone around him. Red lightning flashed nearby, when he thought that this is the difference between him and them. Suddenly the guy's eyes widened. Red capillaries were visible on the whites of his eyes. Aang fell into a dark space, leaving splashes behind him as he continued to fall down. The red demonic hand reached out to the guy flying down, who spread his arms to the sides. Above him was a red demon, smiling at Aang as he widened his eyes in fear, hovering above the demon's red paw with long claws. He looked down, frowning and gritting his teeth, mentally asking what was going on and where all the energy had gone. White sparks were emanating from the device connected to the crystal, and the core underneath began to crack. The device bounced off the core on the guy's chest. Aang lifted his head up, and black liquid flew out of his mouth. He fell to his knees and extended his hand to the inspector, wearily asking him to stop and the fact that this body could not withstand such a load. He looked at the guy with anger, loudly asking what was happening, and apparently this was a malfunction in the equipment. The male inspector looked at his tablet while the main character pulled his trembling hand forward. The man said that the synchronization level had dropped to 10%. Jai Yaedang and the girl next to him looked at this. The girl sighed, holding the planets in her hands, and said that they had just discovered a broken demon core and perhaps it was a defective core, which is why there was an error in the data. The captain raised an eyebrow, looking questioningly at the place tests, and asked about the equipment error. The captain closed his eyes and sighed silently. He turned to the girl, asking that the final result of synchronization is 10%. The girl looked at her tablet and answered affirmatively, saying that the guy passed the test. On the platform, 2 inspectors stood next to Aang, who spread his arms to the sides. Lan Sinua was running towards him. The guy ran up to the main character, calling him. One of the inspectors nearby said that he was just overtired and would rest and be fine. Other cadets who had not passed the tests looked at this. Someone said that they say that this demon core turned out to be defective. Another laughed and replied that he thought he really had that level. Another cadet said that he was too frail and how could he have such a huge level of organization. Another replied that such a level of synchronization was almost like that of S-Rank city captains. Lan Sinua raised the guy's head, putting his other hand on his waist, sitting down next to him and asking how he was. Aang was lying on the floor with a stupid smile on his face and asked if it was Grandpa. Sidu Liu looked at him with her hands on the edge of the window and frowned and chuckled. She waved a small sign with a drawn cross and, closing her eyes, shouted that there was no need to worry and she was already thinking that there was someone better than her in this city and should not be missed. Lan Sinua carried the trembling body of the main character in his arms. He threw his head back and tiredly thought that he couldn't believe that he would now argue with these brats, and fortunately he passed the test. Suiju Yaohui photographed the guys from all sides. Her cheeks turned red when she thought how cute it was. Recreation room. Aang sat on a bench, hunched over and looking down. He put his hand on his knee, asking what it was, and it was as if all the energy was instantly pumped out of him. The guy clenched his teeth, lowered his head and narrowed his eyes, saying that this had never happened before and it was obvious that by force of will he could reach at least 80% synchronization, and even the most damaged cores should not break. The guy turned around when the sliding doors to the recreation room opened. The silhouette of the captain was visible between them, who shouted for everyone to stand at attention. The other cadets shouted that they understood the order, standing up and putting their hands behind their backs. Aang stood up on trembling legs, leaning on a bench nearby. The captain and several other people stood at the door to the room. Jai Yaedang clenched his hands into fists, looking at the cadets with a serious look. He walked past the cadets with his hands behind his back and congratulated everyone who made it to the final stage of the test. The man frowned, narrowing his yellow eyes, and said that this would be a practical task. They would face a demon for the first time in their lives. A man in a red hoodie stood in front of a giant demon with red bright eyes, who placed his clawed paw on the stone next to the man. The other cadets looked at the captain in fear, their mouths open in surprise, as Jai Yaedang said that he hoped that each of them could make it through this safely and successfully. One of the men next to the captain told the third squad to line up and go. A group of cadets walked forward while Aang hunched over, standing next to the benches with his head hung low. He walked past the captain behind the rest of the soldiers. His eyes turned white with fatigue and he muttered that he was going to die and how bad he felt. Jai Yaedang looked at the main character who walked past him. He looked at the place where the guy was standing, noticing a small red stone near the benches. The captain crouched near this stone, picking it up. In the captain's hand was a red crystal that cast a faint red light, with red particles flying around. The man clutched the stone in his hand, looking towards the exit from the room, where the figure of a man was visible. He said that he was becoming more and more interested in what Aang could show next. The main character ran forward, clenching his hands into fists. The captain looked at him with a calm face. He said that he was looking forward to the next stage of the blind hunt, and he would see what the guy would show. A pair of ravens flew over a huge city surrounded by city walls. The wing of a raven, from which a black feather fell. People lined up next to the gate to the exit from the city. Someone shouted to open the gate. The cadets stood near the gate with their hands behind their backs, and behind them a black feather fell to the ground. A small streak of light appeared in the connector as the gate rose up. Several people stood next to the gate as it slowly opened, the wind blowing through it. Aang closed one eye, putting his hand to his head, looking up. The other cadets opened their mouths in surprise. Someone said that this was the first time he went outside the city walls. Another asked if it was true that there was always fog outside the city walls. Aang understood that 60 years later everyone lives in such closed cities. Someone shouted for them to stop chatting, and if they have free time, let them check their equipment, otherwise they won't even know that they died. A group of cadets stood in front of the black and yellow barrier strip on the floor in front of the gate. The main character lowered his head and touched his red core on his chest, thinking that he was given a new intact demon core. But he does not think that the problem is in him, and at the moment when the energy disappeared, there was a feeling that something inside him rejected the core demon. The guy walked forward, closing his eyes, and walked through the city gates, thinking about what was happening and whether it was due to time travel. The main character, wearing black sneakers, stepped onto the yellow ground, which sent impulses through the air. His eyes widened in shock and he clenched his teeth. Red pulses of energy emanated from the place where the main character stood. They walked further from the city walls, near which Aang stood. Red pulses came from the city, passing further through the forest among the trees. Demons were visible in the distance. The demons turned around when the red pulses passed nearby and bared their mouths, looking in that direction. They ran away from the red pulse, running back from them. A large cave. Thick tree roots grew around the stones. The red pulse passed further to this place. The dark entrance to the cave, in the distance of which nothing was visible. The impulse continued to move further into it. He walked deeper into the cave, on the wall of which tree roots grew. Inside the cave, everything was lit by a single torch. Skulls and bones were scattered everywhere, and on a throne of bones sat the silhouette of a demon, a red pulse running across the floor inside the cave. The demon felt this by opening his mouth, in which sharp fangs were visible. The demon cast a shadow on the wall. You could see how he stood up abruptly. Red sparks were flying nearby, and many skulls were visible under his feet. The demon said that this could not be, and a demon more powerful than him appeared. Aang's eyes widened in surprise and he knitted his eyebrows, opening his mouth. He thought that he had just seen a demon, and for a second it seemed to him as if something inside had responded. The guy looked down. Someone behind him asked if he was coming. Aang turned around, and a dissatisfied Sidu Liu stood next to him, arms crossed over her chest. The main character awkwardly scratched the back of his head and smiled, apologizing to the girl. Lan Sinuo came around the corner, asking what happened to the guy. A girl with pink hair looked out from behind the wall, taking a photo of something. The main character looked at them, saying their names. A man in a white and red suit pointed at them, shouting that they would work as a group. The cadets looked at the man. He shouted that the others were already ready and that they should come here. Further from the city walls, all the cadets lined up. Aang shouted that he understood, standing next to the other three friends. Suiju Yaohui leaned towards Aang with a smile, looking at him, and asked his strategy for working in a team. The guy answered in the negative and tried to say something else. Sidu Liu walked past them, closing her eyes and telling them not to get in the way. The guy looked at her in surprise. The girl with white hair walked forward with a calm look. He was embarrassed to think that she was so afraid that no one would want to work with her as a team. Lan Sinuo smiled and put his hand on the main character's back, saying that they need to go, and they also need to give it their all. Holding out their hands, they were photographed by Suiju Yaohui. The girl held out her hand with a camera that reflected white light. The girl stood in front of the camera, showing 2 fingers and smiling. In the background, Lan Sinuo, Sidu Liu, and Aang walked forward. The girl with pink hair said that let everything work out for them. Surrounded by walls, stood a large black obelisk with a white triangle symbol in a circle. An obelisk of dispersal. A black obelisk built from solid stone. The stone it is built from is made of a special substance that dispels fog. The employee put his hands behind his back, standing in front of a group of cadets. He shouted that the 3rd stage was taking place in teams of 4, and he hoped that the purpose of the task was clear to them. This was a blind hunt. The cadets were told to split into their groups. One of the cadets extended his hands, taking a jar from an employee. Another employee stood nearby, holding a box of daggers in his hands. The cadets were told that they would be given a combat dagger and a mini fog dispelling device, made from the same stone as the dispelling obelisk. The cadet was holding in his hands a transparent ampoule containing a fragment of a black stone. They were told that their task was as simple as possible. A red luminous point was visible near the city gate. They entered an area with fog, and then reached the designated place. 2 demon drawings appeared next to the red dot, which were crossed with 2 swords. They need to install a device to dispel the fog, and the hunt for lower rank demons will begin. A stack of cards on which there was a picture of a person. In the evaluation column there were 2 columns of personal skills and teamwork. Under the rating column there was a question mark. The performance of each of them will be evaluated according to individual skills and teamwork. Either they passed or failed miserably. They were wished good luck. Many demons with red glowing eyes that were hidden by the fog, hunting blindly. This is the fear of any newbie that they have to overcome. In this world already shrouded in fog, the warriors will have to fight with unknown dangers that lurk in the fog. A group of cadets walked on the bare ground. In front of them there was a dense fog, where a point of red light could be seen. It takes more than just physical fitness and experience to become a warrior. A group of 4 cadets were running from an explosion nearby, 2 pairs of red eyes looking at them from the fog. One of the cadets with short black hair, clenching his teeth, he placed a capsule with a black stone on the ground and it glowed red. It is unknown how they will behave when faced with danger, but by working as a team, they can overcome their fear. The fog began to clear. A group of 4 cadets stood between 3 demons who were circling around them. 2 demons hung over a group of cadets. They opened their wide mouths, sticking out their tongues. Saliva flowed from their mouths. One of the demons extended his clawed paw towards the cadets. They must hunt, destroy the demons that get in their way. In the end, after killing the demon for the first time, they will become warriors. The huge corpse of the red demon was lying on the ground. One of the cadets was standing on top of it. Another was sitting on his body. The other 2 cadets were breathing heavily, standing next to each other on the ground. The bloody paw of another demon was visible. The huge Gorod gates were closed. 3 people stood on the wall, looking at the cadets. They were told that the test was beginning and the next group needed to get ready. The cadets were divided into groups of 4 people. A little further there were 3 corpses of red demons. The man on the wall looked down at them, saying that there were so many newcomers this time. A girl with long red hair and a short black dress put her hand on her waist, her long hair blowing in the wind. She said that she was pursuing her own personal goals and was only interested in Sidu Liu from the Sidu clan. The red-haired girl with blue eyes smiled. 2 scars were visible under her eyes. The captain of the 2nd squad of the city of Helios, Dada Jio. The girl turned to Jai Yedeng and the other blue-haired man with a smile, asking what they thought. A man with blue hair and purple eyes put his hand to his face, thoughtfully saying that Sidu Liu is from a martial arts clan with good training, and she could make a good warrior. The captain of the 1st squad of Helios City, Joel. Jai Yedeng crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at the cadets and said that there was one more person to pay attention to. Aang stood in front of the 3 friends with a smile, spreading his arms to the sides. The guy smiled, looking at them with yellow eyes. The man thought about him. He frowned, remembering the red split core. The captain thought that he had checked on purpose, and his previous demon core was definitely fine. But what happened then? Suddenly, Jai Yedeng was weakly punched on the cheek and the man's eyes widened in surprise, his mouth opening. Dada Jio looked at him with a smile. Holding out her hand, the sun was shining brightly behind her and the girl asked what he was thinking about, calling him Dang Dang. Jai Yedeng looked irritated at the girl, blushing, and said not to call him that. She stuck out her tongue at him. The guy with blue hair smiled and closed his eyes, saying that only Dada Jio could make him blush, and also called him Dang Dang. The man shouted that Joel especially can't call him that. Dada Jio looked away and frowned, saying with a serious face that they know that demons are divided into ranks and only low-rank demons trained by them should be in the testing area. Jai Yedeng looked down with a frown and told her not to worry. A huge city surrounded by walls. Trees could be seen nearby. The man said that for the safety of today's test, they made sure that there were not even first-rank demons near the city of Helios for several days. Joel smiled, looking down at the cadets. 3 captains stood on the city wall, looking at the cadets. In the distance one could see dust rising from the battle. A man with blue hair said that if they appeared, they would do everything to protect their future warriors. A blue sky with white clouds floating across it. One of the inspectors shouted that the test for this group was over. A man in a red and white suit stood near a cloud of fog, shouting that the site was prepared and asking the next group to prepare. One of the cadets said that this was the Sidu Liu group. The other said that Aang was also there. Lan Sinuo slammed his fist into his palm. Smiling, Aang bent down, preparing to run, holding a capsule with a black stone in his hands, saying that it was their turn. 2 girls stood next to him. Sidu Liu extended her hand to the capsule that the main character was holding. She grabbed the capsule and ran forward, holding it. Aang raised an eyebrow, looking questioningly at his hand, which previously contained a capsule with a black stone. Sidu Liu turned around at them, holding the capsule in her hands and shouted for them to run after her. The girl winked and excitedly thought that they could only look at her with their mouths open. The black-haired boy clenched his teeth in irritation, closing his eyes, a vein popping out on his cheek as he said she was just showing off. The three ran after the girl through the fog. A red light was visible in the distance. Aang shouted to keep up. Sidu Liu jumped onto one leg, raising the other. She held a capsule and a dagger in her hands. The girl pushed off the ground with force, jumping as the others ran after her. The girl turned over in the air, her legs stretched out, while the three others looked at her. She somersaulted in the air and brought her hand with the capsule back, flying to the place where the flask needed to be installed. Sidu Liu inserted the capsule into the devices with a sharp pop. She pressed it with both hands, getting down on one knee. Inside the capsule the stone glowed red. Sparks were visible inside. Dada Gyo smiled, looking to the side, and said that although she has a green health core, she moves no worse than a blue agility core, and that's what the offspring of the martial arts clan are like. Three demons with glowing red eyes. One of the demons had only one eye in the middle, and in place of the second one a black cut in the shape of a cross could be seen. Growling and baring their teeth, they ran towards Sidu Liu, who stood in front of the capsule. Aang frowned as he ran forward and shouted to Lan Sinuo that they were starting. He also frowned and said that he understood. Lan Sinuo leaned his sneaker on the ground, breaking the stones under his eyes. His chest core and eyes glowed with yellow light. Lightning sparked from his eyes. The guy jumped up sharply, flying towards the demons next to the girl. He landed on one knee in front of Sidu Liu, who looked at him in surprise, his body glowing yellow, the rocks underneath him breaking apart. The guy clenched his hand into a fist, around which yellow energy sparkled. Two demons jumped at him, baring their teeth, and the third roared loudly, opening his mouth. Lan Sinuo extended his hand, putting out a yellow shield in front of him, which the three demons crashed into. Jai Yaedeng smiled while looking at him and said that this is not bad and he is already used to the core. Aang twirled the short dagger between his fingers. He grabbed it tightly, holding it behind his back, looking at the demons high in the sky, shouting for them to kill them one by one, and called Sidu Liu and Suiju Yaohui. The girl with pink hair smiled widely, agreeing. Sidu Liu said with a calm face that he was also asking. The three leaned on the ground below them, pushing away from it. They leapt forward at the demons, holding daggers in their hands, their chest cores glowing, and Lan Sinuo stood behind them holding a yellow shield in front of him. Round 1. Sketchy drawing of Suiju Yaohui and a demon with 4 red eyes. The girl with pink hair frowned, holding out her hand with a dagger in front of her. She found herself in front of the demon, striking him with rapid blows with a dagger that left behind a bright blue light. The demon raised his hands, opening his mouth. He threw his head back as Suiju Yaohui swung, her tongue sticking out, and numerous cuts ran across his body, which glowed with a blue light. The girl leaned her feet on the demon, on whose body drops of blood were visible. She abruptly pushed away from him, throwing the demon away, and raised her hands up, exclaiming. The demon flew to the ground with his arms raised, green blood flowing out of him. Lan Sinuo appeared next to him, clenched his teeth and punched the demon's stomach. A yellow pulse from the blow ran through his body, and green drops of blood flew out nearby. The demon flew forward from the guy, leaving a mark on the ground. Suiju Yaohui landed on one knee next to him. Joel watched the battle from the city wall, saying that the two worked surprisingly well together. He put his hand to his chin, blushing slightly, and chuckled, saying that especially the girl and the blue agility core made her movements smoother. Jai Yaedeng looked at him irritably and asked where he was looking anyway. Round 2. Sketchy drawing of Sidu Liu and the demon without eyes. The girl's eyes reflected the demon and she frowned. Sidu Liu raised her arms above herself, jumping in front of the demon and raising her dagger to strike. She exhaled loudly and, leaning her feet on the demon, stuck a dagger into his body, from which a bright green light shone. The demon's blood sprayed out from his wound. Sidu Liu was clutching a dagger in her hand, the blade of which glowed with a bright light, and streaks of energy came from it. At the place where she stood, the demon's body swelled and turned green, and the demon groaned in pain. Sidu Liu jumped away from him, resting her hand on the ground. Behind her, the demon fell back, throwing fragments of stones from the ground. She opened her mouth, hair falling into her face as she told the demon to burn. A huge green explosion thundered behind the girl, throwing away dense clouds of fog. A powerful impulse passed along the ground. Round 3. Sketchy drawing of Aang and a demon with one eye. The guy brought his hand with the dagger back, jumping at the red demon, who stretched his clawed paws forward. Aang frowned at him, his golden eyes glowing faintly, and the guy thought that first he needed to deal with the 3 most vulnerable spots. He thought about the throat. The protagonist's dagger cut the demon's neck, leaving behind a red streak of light, blood flowing from the wound. The guy thought about the heart, striking the demon's chest, which left a streak of light and blood gushed out. He threw another long punch at the demon, who was glowing red, thinking about the demon's belly. Aang jumped forward away from the demon as green blood flowed from the wound on his side and he fell backwards. The demon and the guy rolled head over heels on the ground, raising dust from the ground. Aang clenched his teeth and grabbed the ground with a short dagger, looking up. He thought that the explosive power of this flimsy body was really poor, and he needed to take this chance and test what it was capable of. He rose to his feet, lowering his head. Many cracks were visible on the ground beneath him. The guy's body glowed with red light. The main character ran forward sharply, holding a dagger in his hand, his eyes glowing with a bright red light, leaving a long streak of light behind him. The huge demon opened its mouth and raised its fist behind its back, squeezing it. He struck the guy with his fist, but he dodged to the side. His face was hidden by a shadow. Only his eyes glowing red were visible. Aang sharply thrust his dagger into the side of the demon, clenching his teeth, and he growled loudly, opening his mouth with sharp fangs. The guy frowned, looking up and thought it was too slow. The demon swung his leg, throwing the main character back. A streak of green demon blood stretched from his dagger, and a red streak of light from his eyes. The guy transferred the dagger to his other hand, grabbing it tightly. Aang rested his hand on the ground, preventing himself from falling, raising his dagger hand to strike as the demon looked down at him. Reaching out his hand, he sharply thrust the dagger into the demon's stomach, and he stretched out his paws. The guy thought that he was moving too incoherently. The demon clenched his sharp teeth. Drops of blood were visible on his fangs. He swung his left paw sharply towards Aang, swinging the other back, his red eye glowing brightly. The main character's dagger slipped out of a cut on the demon's body, from which green blood flowed. Aang pushed off the ground, dodging the demon's blow, and he flew over the main character, opening his mouth from which saliva dripped and stretching his paw forward. Aang delivered a long, powerful strike to the demon's mouth, jumping in front of it, leaving a bright red light behind the cut. He landed on his feet on the ground, resting his hand on it. The demon in front of him fell face first into the ground. The protagonist left a streak of red light behind his feet. He thought that he did not have enough explosive power. Aang twirled his dagger in his hand as the rest of the group looked at him. Lan Sinuo opened his mouth in surprise, saying that Aang seemed to be playing with him. Suiju Yaohui held a camera in front of her, saying that she had filmed everything. Sidu Liu calmly looked at him, mentally frowning and pouting her lips, thinking that he was just showing off and was deliberately showing off. Dada Jio raised her eyebrows in surprise, looking at the guy, and asked in surprise who this thin boy was. The girl with red hair put her hand to her forehead, saying that he has such power and that's not bad. Joel put his finger to his chin with a smile, saying that it's not only about strength, but also about the way he moves, and he's very skilled. Jai Yeding silently looked down at the test site, frowning and pursing his lips. Aang leaned on his knees, standing in front of the demon, under which there was a huge puddle of green blood. Beads of sweat were dripping from his chin and he was breathing heavily, saying that this was the end. The guy wiped his face and raised his head, frowning and thinking that in this body he cannot use any of the skills from the past. And also this shortness of breath at the slightest movement. Everything turns out lousy. He placed his black sneaker foot on the ground and said he was done with his ordeal. Aang ran towards the demon, whose whole body was covered in blood. He said that it was time to end him too. Aang's foot stepped on the ground next to the demon, and a red appendage appeared nearby and burst through the ground. The guy's eyes widened. A red spike grew next to him, which was reflected in his golden eyes. The red demon was sharply pierced by a huge red appendage. Blood poured out of his body in all directions. The main character was thrown to the side, and tree roots came out of the ground. The rest of the group looked around, inspecting the thick tree roots. Suiju Yaohui said that they were surrounded by tree vines. Aang looked at the huge red thorn that pierced the red demon and asked what it was. Silhouette like a sharp demonic paw burst out through the demon's flesh, tearing the flesh. Two sharp clawed paws grabbed the body of the dead demon, who lowered his head low. A demon with gray skin and a red spike on his back tore the flesh of the red demon. His head was like a skull, light gray in color. Aang looked at this in shock. His eyes widened, green drops of blood flying in front of him. The demon with a gray skull exhaled sharply. White steam flew nearby. No eyes were visible on his head. Green blood flowed down his skull and claws. The demon opened his mouth wide with sharp fangs and roared loudly, red dark energy gathering around him. Red fog was flying in the sky near the city. Jai Yedang and Dada Jio stood on the city wall while a thick red fog streamed towards them. The man's eyes widened and a small pulse of white light passed from his face. He pursed his lips and looked ahead anxiously, his eyes red. The captain lowered his head, mouth parted, his face completely hidden in shadow. Jai Yedeng lowered his head and clenched his teeth, his face contorted with rage. He looked at the test site. The group with the main character was surrounded by thick vines. The man shouted that this was a first-rank demon. The man shouted for everyone to get back outside the city walls. Many cadets fled from the huge vines, panic etched on their faces. Joel and Dada Gyo jumped off the city wall, with a bright red light shining around the girl, and a blue light around the guy. Near the city wall, 2 strong explosions sounded on the ground, lifting sand from the ground. Dust flew in the air, fluttering. Dada Gyo and Joel ran forward from the fog. The girl frowned. She jumped to the side, shouting that they should not panic and that Captain Jai Yedeng was safe next to him and he would help them get to the city walls. A huge demon stood in front of the main character and the rest of the group. He asked what these people were and if there was a demon here. Aang looked at him in shock and fear when someone from the group asked that one of them had the power of a demon, and what was he saying? A demon with a skull instead of a face leaned towards the guy. Black ribbons with 2 rings at the ends were flying around him. He asked the main character if it was him. Powerful red energy emanated from the demon as it stood in front of the group. Suiju Yaohui, Lan Sinuo and Sidu Liu looked at him in fear, trembling. The girl with white hair asked that this was the first-rank demon. She thought that he was not at all like the lower-rank demons. She imagined how the vines of the tree were wrapped around her neck and waist. One of them climbed into the girl's mouth. Sidu Liu thought that they would be finished within a couple of moments and they would be completely immobilized. A huge demon, red glowing eyes were visible on his shoulders and wrists. Aang looked at him, a drop of sweat running down his cheek, and he thought that this body would definitely not be able to withstand a first-rank demon. He frowned, looking up at him and gritting his teeth, saying that this was the first time he felt this way. And usually warriors often say that they feel a sense of hopelessness when faced with a demon. The demon held out a brown paw with white claws. There was red energy around him. He said that he would take a look. A small red ball appeared near each demon's claw and glowed brightly. The demon said to bind them all. He clutched the demon's paws and white threads stretched to the heads of the cadets from the group. The people's eyes turned white, and a white mist emanated from their foreheads. They all fell to the ground, while the demon looked at them with his hand outstretched. A sound was heard from the side. The demon turned around. A crack was visible at the root of the thick vines. The huge vines of the tree were broken by Joel and Dada Gyo. The girl jumped high, kicking the roots, and the guy broke them with his hands, lowering his head. He looked up, shouting for the demon not to touch the cadets. The first-rank demon looked towards the guy and smiled, saying this. Joel and Dada Gyo ran towards the demon, roots rising up around it. He said goodbye to them, saying that he had to take his leave. The roots around the demon completely covered the demon's face. Only his mouth was visible. Huge roots retracted into the ground, leaving behind a huge crater. Joel and Dada Gyo stood next to it in shock. They looked down. Fog was flying in the air. A girl with red hair said that he took 4 cadets with him. To the side of the huge crater, the ground rose. Red pulses of energy passed through it. The 2 looked in surprise as something underground was rapidly moving away from them. Joel looked at this, frowning, and he shouted that they should run after him. A dense forest with fog flying around it. Dada Gyo bent over the rising ground, saying that the tracks end here. Joel stood next to him. The girl frowned and bit her group, looking up, saying that Jai Yedeng had been checking everything for several days. But then why didn't he notice the presence of a first-rank demon? He is usually very thorough in this matter. They stood at a small hillock of earth from which white fog emanated. The guy said that this had never happened before. Jai Yedeng jumped above the 2 of them, calling out to them, and they raised their heads. The captain landed on the ground next to them, rolling forward and lifting the earth behind him, asking if they had found the guys. He frowned, raising his hand and looking at them, asking in surprise why they stopped and they should continue the pursuit. Joel showed him a small hill of sand, telling him to calm down and that the tracks stop here. The man looked at the ground in surprise. A girl with red hair stood next to him, saying that it seems that the demon has gone even deeper into the ground, and that they don't know what's ahead and it's dangerous to go there. Jai Yedeng bent down to the ground, running his fingers along it. He placed his white-gloved hand on the mound of earth. The captain remembered how a little boy with blonde hair was being dragged away by a purple monster. The boy extended his hand and called for his brother. The man sharply hit the ground with his fist, cursing. A powerful impulse from the blow went through, and stones broke under his fist. The man frowned, lowered his head, his body trembled weakly, and he pursed his lips and said that it was all his fault, and he was to blame for not noticing the threat. Jai Yedeng rested his hands on the ground while Joel and Dada Gyo stood looking at him. He shouted that it was all because of him. Joel looked at the man with sadness, saying that they should return and there was probably panic in the city. He said that without the three of them it would be worse, and after that they would send a reconnaissance group to inspect the areas around the city to make sure that there were no other demons of the first rank. Dada Jio silently lowered her gaze, looking sadly at the man. She leaned towards him and touched Jai Yaedang's shoulder, talking about the 4 cadets, and no one wanted this to happen. But they need to remain calm, and she understands that it is difficult now. The man brushed the girl's hand off his shoulder and she removed it. He rose from the ground leaning on his knee and lowering his head, saying that they could return on their own. But he would still look and let them not worry about him. Joel frowned, looking at him with clenched teeth, and he asked seriously now. The red-haired girl put her hand on the guy's chest, stopping him, and looked sadly at Jai Yaedang, telling him to be sure to come back before sunset. Jai Yaedang looked at her over his shoulder and answered the girl exactly. He ran forward, fog surrounding him as the two watched the man leave. Dada Jio, looking at him, told the guy next to him that they couldn't stop him. Joel ruffled his hair and closed his eyes, saying that he knew, but when his younger brother was dragged away by demons, he blamed himself very much. Dada Jio lowered her gaze, looking down sadly, and said that if his brother had survived then, he would now be the same age as these cadets. She said they reminded him of his brother, blue sky with floating clouds, thick fog flying around. The main character opened his eyes slightly, seeing the dark opening of the cave. He made a surprised sound. Aang looked ahead with a raised eyebrow with an absent-minded look. His body was tied by vines. He asked where he was, and this was a cave. The entire group of 4 people were tied to thick vines. Sidu Liu lowered her head while unconscious. The guy with black hair said that it seemed like everyone was still alive. A huge clawed paw appeared next to his head. The guy's eyes widened in horror when the demon asked if he had woken up. Aang's eyes glowed yellow and he frowned, turning his head towards the demon. He looked in shock at the demon towering over him, a long red blade attached to his back on his bones. Aang tried to get out, trembling and clenching his teeth, while the demon walked near him, saying that he woke up quickly and seemed to be different. The main character looked in surprise at the demon, who stopped. The red dots on the demon's legs glowed red, and standing with his back to the guy, he said that he was different and this was interesting. Aang frowned, and a huge demon's paw was sharply pressed against his face. The demon's paw sharply hit the guy who was tied to the vine. Some debris bounced off the vine to the side. The demon kept his paw on the main character's neck, leaning towards him. The demon's claw left a small cut on the guy's cheek from which blood flowed. The demon asked why their power emanated from him, and he was just a man. How could he be stronger than him? Aang frowned at the demon who was squeezing his face. He clenched his teeth. Drops of blood flowed down his face from his forehead and lips, and he asked what he was talking about. The guy spread his arms out to the sides, clenching them into fists. The vines around him broke. His eyes and the core in his chest cast a bright red light. The demon in front of him jumped back from him. Aang landed on his feet on the ground, head hanging low, a red glow emanating from his body. He clutched a sharp tree branch in his hand. The main character sharply struck a blow towards the demon, but he deflected to the side, the blow leaving behind a long beam of red light. The demon moved his hand back. Dark energy gathered around it, and drops of blood came out. The demon said with fun, "What a quick guy." He swung his arm, throwing a punch, but Aang jumped above the demon, flipping in the air. The guy rolled along the ground, leaning on it with his hand, moving his hand with the weapon back. He clenched his teeth, frowning forward at the demon, and thought that in a previous life he would have been able to chop off his head faster than he could react. Aang looked back, remembering the faces of Suiju Yaohui, Lan Sinuo, and Sidu Liu, who remained unconscious, and thought that he needed to save these 3. Aang ran forward again, pushing off from the ground, towards the demon who was standing by the vines. The guy looked at the demon while he ran away from him. System strips were coming off his spike, arms and legs. The number of demons was written above him 1. Aang thought that he was a demon with a red core, agile, flexible. He had a high reaction and attack speed. At the same time, his joints are not protected by a strong shell, and this is his weak point. The demon extended his paw, from which a red glow emanated, and said that it was not worth it. The main character, clenching his teeth, bent to the side. Yellow stripes of light emanated from his eyes, and 4 red stripes stretched to his shoulder. Silhouettes on a red background of how the demon pierced Aang's shoulder with its claws, which came out, piercing the guy's body right through. The main character grabbed the demon's hand by the place with the shell, holding it tightly, thinking that now, he just needs to find the moment. She leaned forward, raising her hand with the weapon to strike, and thought about the demon's weak point. Aang sharply thrust the weapon into the demon's hand, which was not protected by a shell, and thought about his joints. A bright red glow emanated from the weapon and the protagonist's eyes. The protagonist's hand trembled. He clenched his teeth, and green drops of blood were visible on the demon's hand. Aang thought that it needed to be torn off. With a sharp movement, he tore the demon's hand away from his body, squeezing it in his hand. The demon opened his mouth, green drops of blood flew next to him and he gasped. The black-haired guy smiled as he looked at him. There were green and red drops of blood on his face. He said that you shouldn't underestimate him, and he had destroyed so many first-rank demons in his time. A shadow fell on the demon's face and he let out a malicious "oh," looking at the guy. The demon sharply kneed the main character in the stomach. A strong impulse from the blow passed through his body. Aang's mouth and eyes opened in shock, and drops of blood sprayed out from his mouth. The demon swung his leg and the main character flew back, leaving a huge cloud of dust from the impact. The fog began to dissipate. A mark from the impact was visible on the wall of the cave, and stones fell nearby. Aang sat against the wall, his head bowed low. From the place where he crashed one could see a huge stain of blood that stretched down. His clothes on his chest were torn. There was a bloody trail there. In front of him, the demon's hand fused with his body. The branches of the tree clung to each other. The demon said that he knows about its weak points, but it is like a tree. Its core is a hybrid of red and wood. The demon's hand fused with his shoulder, glowing with a green light. The demon looked at it, saying that he was already fine. Aang looked at the demon with a dull look. One of his eyes was closing as he thought that he was healing his wounds. He remembered the green core and thought that isn't it only demons with a green healing core that can repair their damage, and what did he just say about tree? The guy's eyes widened and he looked forward in shock, realizing that over these half a century the demons had also evolved. The demon clenched his hand into a fist, shook it, green energy dissipated from his shoulder, and he opened his mouth and said that in the end he was underestimated. He extended his hand and waved the finger of his clawed paw. Vines stretched out from the stone where Aang was sitting, piercing him right through, causing drops of blood to fly out of the guy's mouth. The demon told the guy to come up and the vines pulled the main character's body forward, piercing him through, causing him to fly straight towards the demon. The demon grabbed the guy's trembling body by the head, holding him off the ground. Aang looked at the demon, frowning and breathing heavily. The demon let go of the guy's head and his head fell down. The demon said that he could not understand what was wrong with him. The main character looked at the floor with a dull look, thinking that he had touched his organs and it was so painful that he couldn't even take a breath. He thought that he had just gotten here, and he was already going to die like this. On the side of the guy, 3 people from his group were tied to the vines, and he thought that this meant that they would die too. He remembered how he lay on the scorched earth before his death, near the corpses of his comrades, and thought that like his past comrades in a past life, they too would die fighting side by side with him. Aang's eyes became cloudy and closed, with dark bruises visible underneath and drops of blood on his face as he apologized to his friends. A guy was hanging on the vines that pierced his body. Drops of blood were dripping down and he coughed, saying that this was not fair and what the end. The demon bent down in front of the guy, under whom there was a blood stain, and said that he really died and what a fragile person. He opened his mouth, sticking out his tongue covered with saliva, and said that he needs to evolve and whether he will evolve by eating it. The demon opened its mouth wide, stretched its tongue towards the guy and leaned towards his head, saying that he needed to devour him. The white-haired creature opens its golden eyes slightly, making a surprised sound. A powerful dark red energy emanates from Aang's body, looming over the demon, and the creature asks to absorb it. The guy's body flies away from the demon, who staggers back, looking at him. The voice coming from the guy, who lowered his head, says that he cannot die yet, otherwise the whole plan will go downhill. The red core of Aang cracks and a red light emanates from it. Fragments of the core fly down from the chest of the main character, who lowered his head and hands low. The creature said that he would never have thought that he would have to use his last strength for such a thing, and, moreover, in such a place. The body of the demon, who was looking at the guy, trembled, and he asked what he was and what the oppressive atmosphere was. Bands of red energy were circling around Aang's body. He cast a bright red light and particles were flying in the air. The demon recoiled, looking at this, and he asked the 5th rank, the 6th. The guy's body flew up. The creature gasped. Instead of the core on his chest there was nothing else, and the wound on his stomach disappeared. Aang spread his arms to the sides as red energy emanating from his chest swirled around him, and the creature asked about the 6th rank. a red hand with long white claws. The main character's legs turned into red demonic ones. Instead of the main character, a demon with a red body and white stripes on it hovered in the air. His hair turned white, and red horns were visible in his head, and fragments of stones fell nearby. The creature's white eyelashes and dark patterns under its eyes were visible. A strong red explosion occurred in the cave next to the demon. A column of light pierced the ceiling of the cave. Stones flew away from it, and the demon covered its face with its hands. A huge red column of red energy pierced the ground. White sparks and dark lightning flashed around it. A huge red dome passed across the ground. Powerful red and dark energy emanated from the ground, which was looked at by lower-ranking demons. The red dome swept through the demons, tearing their flesh from their bones, leaving behind only skeletons in their place. On the ground where the red dome passed, there was nothing left except for a few particles of flesh that the demons left behind. In the distance, a red column of energy could be seen reaching up to the sky, leaving powerful pulses in the air. In the crater that the energy pierced, powerful red energy gathered around the red creature. Flying around, the first-rank demon looked at it. The red demon flew above the ground with the help of his wings. He extended his hand towards the first-rank demon. His white hair reached his shoulder blades. He said that he was the only one of his kind. The 8th rank, the strongest demon with a red power core, their king. The first-rank demon looked at the red demon, trembling in fear, and muttered about the 8th rank and their king. The red demon's white hair fluttered in the air, and he opened his mouth, telling the demon to kneel down. The first-rank demon immediately knelt in front of him, kicking up dust underneath them. The king spread his arms to the sides. The guy above him, a bright white light fell on him from a hole in the ground. He ordered his name to be called. The first-rank demon lowered his head, trembling, and said that he was an 8th-rank demon Kai. The king looked down on him. His eyelashes and hair were white and the whites of his eyes were black. His face was pale, his neck black, and his forehead, ears, and body red. The area where the destroyed houses stood was surrounded by dense white fog. Jai Yaedeng jumped over one of the destroyed buildings, his chest core leaving a streak of red light. The man frowned, looking ahead with his yellow eyes. He knelt down on the ground with his hand on the ground, a red light emanating from his body, one of his eyes also glowing red. Several huge demon lizards with green and red skin turned towards the red light, which passed by them and bounced further. The man stood behind the green lizard. His eyes cast a red streak of light, and he moved his hand back. Jai Yaedeng sharply hit the demon in the stomach. Red energy flowed from the blow, and green blood sprayed from the demon's mouth. He turned around and kicked the second demon, leaving a red streak of light behind. The man raised his leg high, hitting the demon in the face, and he threw it back. Jai Yaedeng suddenly lowered his leg, pushing the red demon into the ground, and the demon opened its mouth wide as a powerful blow struck its neck, drops of green blood flying out of its mouth. Jai Yaedeng looked down at the dead demons, adjusted his white gloves, and said that there were only 2 low-ranking demons in this district, and the guys were nowhere to be seen. The man raised his head, looking up, saying that he needed to continue the search and find them before sunset. The sky above Jai Yaedeng's head turned orange. A dense white fog surrounded him, and 2 dead demons lay nearby. Suddenly, a huge red pillar of light appeared behind the captain, and he widened his eyes in shock. The man turned towards where the red light was coming from. Powerful pulses of red energy were moving across the ground. Jai Yaedeng covered his face with his hand and closed one eye, gritting his teeth, asking out loud if this was an energy wave. He looked at the huge column of smoke from which a bright red light had just emanated and asked where it came from. A huge crater with white mist coming from it. Jai Yaedeng shouted that it was possible that the cadets were there. King Kai flew over the first-rank demon, flapping his demonic wings. A white bone appeared on his legs, gathering red particles. He stood on the ground with the help of white bones that sprouted from his feet. The king walked up to the first-rank demon who was kneeling in front of him and lowered his head low, calling him Your Majesty in a trembling voice. Kai scratched the back of his head and closed his eyes. Behind him there were cadets tied to the vines. He said that he knew that he would have to transform in such a hole. He asked the first-rank demon to answer him, and he raised his head tremblingly, making a confused sound and then agreeing. The king narrowed his eyes, looking down at the demon, and asked, after his disappearance, if there were still 5 demon kings left. 5 demon silhouettes appeared behind King Kai, cores of purple, green, yellow, blue, and black glowing brightly in their chests. The first-rank demon bowed his head low, resting his hands on the ground, and said that yes, there are 5 demon kings, and now there are only 5 demon kings. Nothing has changed. King Kai smiled and said that they seemed to have hit it off. He smiled widely and laughed, his golden eyes casting a golden reflection. The king extended his hand, near which red energy gathered. The demon of the first rank staggered back and covered his face with his hand. The king asked loudly if they had forgotten what they had done 60 years ago. King Kai sadly looked at his hand and remembered how he reached out with his hand to the floor of the dead Aang on the battlefield, saying that having chosen the body of this so-called strongest warrior of humanity as a vessel, he did not think that in the new time his body would be so worthless, and this disappointed him. The king stood in front of the first rank demon. There were thick vines behind him. He said that that's why he had to waste his last strength to deal with this nonsense, and the next time he can transform, maybe only when he finally will get stronger. King Kai held his hand over his neck, which was shaking. He threw back his head and closed his eyes, clasping his neck with his hand and saying that this was testing his patience and still waiting for this strongest warrior to learn to control demonic memories. The first rank demon bowed his head low, next to the king's feet, and spoke about the demonic memories, saying that the memories the king was talking about gave them the ability to evolve. King Kai's back, his 2 wings, 4 spikes on his shoulders and 2 horns on his head glowed red. He said that the demon fin is part of their body, and the more a demon has, the more powerful he is. He turned his back to the first rank demon and walked away from him, closing his eyes and saying that when a demonic creature grows a new fin, this is evolution, and that is what demonic memories are for. This is the exclusive ability of their subspecies, and the reason why they always will be superior to other creatures. This human warrior Aang is very similar to them. The first rank demon remembered how he gnawed the throat of another demon who looked like him. King Kai said that only they need to gnaw the throats of other demons of the same rank in order to evolve. Aang with his eyes closed and his face calm. The demon king said that Aang needs to absorb the demonic beings of the highest ranks, and also learn demonic memories. The king stood with his back to the first rank demon, who knelt before him. Kai said that he would then evolve. The king turned around, putting his finger to his temple and smiled, saying that this was his gift from him, so to speak. The first rank demon spread his arms to the sides and raised his head, shouting that this was a wonderful plan and he was delighted. The demon extended his hand forward, placing the other one to his chest, trembling, and saying that the king should allow him to help, and he will do everything he can and let him become his faithful assistant. King Kai swung his hand sharply, cutting the demon with a streak of black energy, his eyes glowing brightly with golden light. Green drops of blood flew next to the king's face and he looked down at the first rank demon, saying that he was not worthy. The king extended his hand, using his finger to lure the broken stone, inside of which the red core glowed. He said that there was one thing it would be good for. From the headless body of the first rank demon, small balls and threads of red energy stretched out, gathering at King Kai's chest. He looked at him and said that he would be the one to awaken the memories in this human warrior. The DNA structure, next to which small red balls were flying, Kai said, turning to Aang, that he had taken the first steps for him. The king smiled as the DNA structure flew in front of him, casting a soft red light, and told him not to disappoint him in his future endeavors. King Kai's face crumbled, revealing Aang's face behind him, who closed his eyes. The king said that he needed him to gradually reach the 8th rank. King Kai's body fell away from Aang like a shell. The guy fell forward while the DNA system hovered near his chest. She flew into the hole in the guy's chest, sparkling with small white lightning. The guy with black hair fell to his knees, head hanging low, his chest glowing red. King Kai said that then he would awaken from his sleep. Threads of red energy emanated from Aang's chest, and a spot on his chest glowed with a bright red light. Green blood flowed through his veins, along with red DNA particles. His guests were covered in red skin. King Kai sat with his knees close to him and his arms wrapped around them, covering his body with his demonic wings. Aang was sitting on his knees, his head bowed low, and many black hands were reaching out to him from the darkness. The hands completely covered the guy. His body was absorbed by dark energy. A small flash of yellow light flashed in the darkness. Someone called the guy, calling him commander. A man with blood on his face looked at Aang. The ground under him was scorched. Fiery sparks were flying nearby. The guy called the main character their strongest commander. The guy's eyes were closing. There were drops of blood next to them and he said that he didn't want to die and she was waiting for him. Aang, in his old body, extended a trembling hand towards the guy, saying that he would not die and he would be able to get out. The guy grabbed the main character's hand with his own. The man looked at him in surprise, his mouth open. His whole face was covered in blood. The guy screamed that they were all dead. The guy looked at the commander, his face was distorted. The skin on the left side of his face slid off, revealing his skull. Instead of his left eye there was a bright red light, and he asked why Aang survived. The man's eyes widened in shock as he looked at him. Aang sat up abruptly on the bed, holding the edge of the blanket with one hand and stretching the other forward. Beads of sweat covered his face, and his eyes widened, the bangs on his black hair turning white. The guy closed his eyes and smiled, laughing tiredly and saying that it was a dream. He was sitting on a hospital bed behind a screen. A bright orange light was shining from the window. He said it was a memory. Someone pulled back the curtain, calling Aang by name, and the guy looked in that direction. Behind the curtain stood Suiju Yaohui, Lan Sinuo and Sidu Liu. A girl with pink hair jumped up with a smile, calling the guy a sleepyhead. A guy with brown hair smiled, saying that he had finally woken up. Suiju Yaohui approached the guy and leaned over him, causing him to cry out in surprise. The girl raised one eyebrow, looking at him, and asked what was wrong with his hair and whether the demon had specifically dragged him away to highlight it. Aang looked at the girl in shock, covering himself with his hand, and thought that she was close. He loudly asked what she was talking about. He looked at the three friends in surprise while sitting on the hospital ward and said that they were fine, and he remembered how they were dragged into the cave by a first-rank demon. Lan Sinuo replied that everything was fine. Jai Yaedeng stood behind the curtain, pushing it aside with his hand, and said that he seemed to remember something. The man abruptly pulled the curtain aside. He put his hands on his hips, standing in front of the bed where Aang was sitting. Joel and Dada Jio were sitting on chairs next to him. Jai Yaedeng told him to tell him what happened in that cave. The main character looked at the people in front of him in surprise, sitting on the hospital bed, and thought that the other two were like commanders who were at the wall. He asked Jai Yaedeng why he was here. Dada Jio put her hand on her thigh and smiled and extended her other hand, saying that it was Dang Dang who brought the four of them back here. Without turning to look at her, the man with blonde hair asked in a whisper not to call him that. The girl with red hair winked at him and made an OK sign with her fingers, calling him Dang Dang again. Suiju Yaohui, Sidu Liu and Lan Sinuo looked at them silently as they thought of this nickname. Joel sat on a chair, resting his hand on his leg and resting his cheek on his palm, saying that he found them lying on the ground at the entrance to the cave. They were all passed out. Jai Yaedeng stood at the entrance to the cave where four cadets lay unconscious. Joel said that fortunately the demon was not visible nearby, and otherwise it is unlikely that they would have been able to return safely. Dada Jio leaned over to the main character, handed him something, and said that the other three had already woken up, but they said that they didn't remember anything, and he was the only one who lay in a coma for so long, and even changed. The main character looked in surprise at the mirror that the girl held out. She said that he mentioned the cave and let him try to remember something else. Aang took the mirror in his hands, looking at his reflection in surprise, and thought about his hair. And it's really him. And that's what Suiju Yaohui was talking about. He thought how it happened, and everything seems so unreal. The guy remembered how he fought with a demon of the first rank and he pierced him with vines, thinking that he only remembered how he was attacked in the cave. But what happened next was already vague. He put his hand to his forehead and frowned, his yellow eyes glowing faintly as he thought that should he tell them everything including time travel, and they are unlikely to believe him, and the memories are still unclear, and for now he will have to act in person. Aang. Removing his hand from his forehead, the main character looked up, saying that he only remembers how he woke up for a couple of seconds and saw that they were dragged into a cave. Then he immediately passed out, and then everything was in a fog, until waking up now. Jai Yaedeng silently looked at him with a frown and thought that he immediately passed out, and maybe he was making up his mind. He remembered standing by the wall of the cave, where there were many dark blood stains. He thought that in the cave he had discovered huge blood stains on the walls. Sitting on a chair with wheels, Joel lifted his legs, rolling on the floor, and ending up next to the guy, saying that his name was Aang. He stretched out his legs and put his hands in his pockets, lowering his head and smilingly saying that he was just like their greatest warrior, and he saw the results of his entrance test. The form is of course lame, but during the massacre with the demons, he behaved coolly. Joel smiled, his blue hair covering one eye. He asked the main character if he had fought demons before. Aang stretched his hands forward, shouting in concern no, and he was just always interested in battles and independently collected and analyzed the weaknesses of various demons. Dada Jio and Jai Yaedeng looked down at the guy, and the girl put her hand on her hip, saying with a smile that's how talented he is. Such a diligent warrior needs to be well cultivated. Aang looked at them worriedly, eyes wide open, and loudly asked if he passed the entrance test and what the result was. Suiju Yaohui smiled as she looked at him and happily said that he had passed the warrior test, and they were on the same team. The girl held the camera in front of her, closing her eyes and saying that they would work together. Lan Sinuo scratched the back of his head and closed one eye, smiled, saying that apparently this test connected them and Captain Jai Yaedang united the four of them into one group. Sidu Liu was silent, closing my eyes. She looked at the guy and calmly said that they were already far behind the others. Aang looked questioningly at the girl and frowned, asking if they were behind the other teams. Jai Yaedang looked at the guy with a serious look, saying that teams should gain points by completing tasks, and while he was in a coma for 3 days, their team's point balance remained at 0. The White Hospital building shook slightly when the main character asked loudly that he had been in a coma for 3 days. Sidu Liu pulled her white hair back. Lan Sinuo adjusted the collar of his black turtleneck. Suiju Yaohui knelt down on one knee, pulling at their shoes with a smile. Aang smiled, abruptly putting on his white gloves with his other hand. People in the city looked at them in surprise. One of the girls covered her mouth with her hand in surprise. The cadets stood on the street while people surrounded them. Someone said that this was Captain Jai Yaedang. Another said that these were apparently new warriors. Another person said that 3 days ago they also talked about a new group of warriors. Another said that they are so young and have just become warriors, but they should already start working. Jai Yaedang stood in front of the 4 people with his hands behind his back. He said that he would now explain everything briefly, and said that he would first congratulate them on joining the ranks of warriors. Suiju Yaohui, Lan Sinuo, Sidu Liu and Aang stood in front of the man with their hands behind their back, the main character smiling. The 4 cadets looked at the captain as they listened to him say that they had returned alive after their encounter with a rank 1 demon, and he congratulated them on that as well. The man looked down at them with a frown and said that as said earlier, now the 4 of them are one team under his leadership. In other words, he is their captain. He has 9 teams in total and he hopes that they can prove themselves. Aang raised his hand, looking questioningly at the captain and asked what it meant to show oneself. He thought that the current order among warriors was much more troublesome than in his time, and when he first began to join the warriors, only through battles did they gain strength and experience. Lan Sinuo leaned over, looking at the guy and asked if he had never heard of the ranking of junior squads. The main character asked about it. Sidu Liu turned away from the guy while the captain said that apparently the newcomer doesn't understand anything at all, and at the moment they are the last team in the ranking. The girl thought what was wrong with him. Jai Yaedang raised his index finger. There was a numbered table behind him. He said that to prove yourself means to rise up in the ranking table of new teams, and as the captain in charge of them, it is his responsibility to ensure that they score as many points as possible and advance in the ranking. And there are 9 teams in its group, which means they have as many as 8 opponents. The silhouettes of Jai Yaedang, Joel and Dada Jio, who stood above the 3 ranking tables numbered to 9. The captain said that by completing different tasks, you can get different amounts of points depending on the difficulty level of completion. And every month, 3 captains, including him, choose 2 best teams each. A total of 6 best are selected, and for participation in team duels you can receive rewards for first place. Jai Yaedang stood with his hands behind his back. A group of people in blue clothes could be seen behind him. The captain said that in the same way, the last command of each captain would be punished. 4 people in blue suits and masks on their faces were wiping down the building. One of the girls was holding a bucket of water. The captain said that the punishment was a temporary demotion to the cleaning group, until the next month, until the rating is updated. Aang turned to the people, and then back to the captain, saying that this is tiring, but it is clear why it is so clean here. Jai Yaedang replied that this is the order of warriors and competition gives rise to development. Demons are constantly evolving, which means they should not stand on place. Sidu Liu stood with her hands behind her back, looking at the captain as he said that the leader of their team would be Sidu Liu since she scored the most in the crossbreeding test, and asked if there was any objection to that. Lan Sinuo smiled, closing his eyes, and said that he doesn't mind. She's talented and smart. Suiju Yaohui leaned over with a smile and looked at the girl with white hair, saying that he didn't mind either, and she's so strong. Aang pursed his lips, closing his eyes, and thought why didn't anyone suggest him. Aka Aang, the strongest warrior revered as a king. Sidu Liu stepped forward on the ground. She straightened her back and frowned, shouting that they definitely needed to complete the task. The girl mentally smiled and thought that she had been chosen as captain. But who else if not her? The sun was shining brightly, tall buildings towered above everyone. Jai Yaedang led the group further, turning to them and telling them that it was only midday and they could go and see what tasks were on the board and also pay attention to the scores of the other teams. The captain narrowed his eyes, looking at them, and turning over his shoulder, said that their new suits should definitely be tried in a real battle, and that they should ask him if they have any questions. He shouted freely to the fighters. The man waved his hand, leaving the soldiers, and they replied that they understood everything. Sidu Liu walked back from the group, adjusting the gloves on her hands, and said that they should look at the task board and they had already spent 3 days. They need to work hard. The others looked back at her. Suiju Yaohui clenched her hand into a fist and frowned, shouting for her to wait, and they would forget something important. The white-haired girl's eyes widened. She looked over her shoulder at the team and blushed slightly, asking what. Mentally she was crying, thinking how she could forget about something important, about setting up a position, preparing equipment. But it was too early. She thought that first she needed to accept the task, and how could she mess up when she first became the team commander, and is her reputation as a commander already ruined? Suiju Yaohui raised the camera with a smile and said that she would take the first official photo of the team. She stood in front of a girl with white hair, who looked at her silently, holding a camera in front of her face. An gritted his teeth, saying that they would be on a team together. The guy smiled, looking at them, and said that this was not bad. The photo showed Suiju Yaohui holding the camera with her hand raised. Lan Sinuo and Aang crouched down with smiles, while Sidu Liu stood behind with a calm face. Jai Yaedeng stood on the balcony, looking at the city, crossing his arms over his chest. Joel and Dada Jio were nearby. The man asked why they were looking like that. A girl with red hair reached out and said that he said so, that there were not a single demon near the cave, only traces of an explosion. Joel lit a cigarette, holding it in his mouth, and looked at the girl while she said that inside the cave itself there were only pools of blood from an unknown force. The man with blue hair raised an eyebrow at them and asked if this was the work of 4 children. Jai Yaedeng silently looked down with a serious face, and then said that Aang is a strange guy, and he is the one who suspects him. He frowned, remembering the guy surrounded by red energy. The captain said that his instincts told him that something was wrong with him, and he seemed to smell a familiar bad smell. Dada Jio with a wide smile hugged the man's neck from behind, and he opened his eyes in surprise. The girl said that he thinks too much, and the main thing is that the children returned safe and sound. She looked at him, saying that their team showed promise and he needed to train them well so that they would not lose to her guys. Jai Yaedeng turned to her and clenched his teeth, blushing embarrassedly, saying that he was serious. Joel closed his eyes and exhaled cigarette smoke. He looked at them, turned around and leaned on the fence, told them to watch first, and if he noticed something strange, let him tell them. Dada Jio jumped and agreed. Downtown, task board, Aang stood with a finger to his chin, looking at the task board with a raised eyebrow. He smiled, looking at her. There were 3 columns on the board, A, B, C. 3 tasks remained only in column A. The guy said that there are 3 A-level tasks, and for completing each A-level task you can get 10 points. Lan Sinuo looked at him, saying that he apparently doesn't know, and it is the highest level they can access. Suiju Yaohui frowned and showed 3 fingers, saying that the remaining 3 are considered the most difficult among all the A-level tasks. Sidu Liu silently looked up at the board, pursing her lips. Lan Sinuo spread his arms to the sides and bowed his head. Behind him was a table where B6, C3, a 10, as well as scales, were outweighed B and C. He explained that for a level B task they give 6 points, for C 3 points each, and getting 10 points for a level A mission is indeed tempting. But completing tasks of levels B and C is less dangerous. When completing tasks A, emergencies often occur. Aang closed his eyes and raised his head, saying that's how it is. He looked at the board where Sidu Liu was walking and said, well, then. The girl abruptly tore off all 3 sheets with tasks as she and Aang turned to the other 2. The guy smiled. They said in unison that they would take everything. The group ran along the road. They were surrounded by bushes on both sides, and fog was flying in the air. Aang touched the core on his chest, his eyes glowing red. A yellow glow passed from the core on his chest, and something formed on his shoulders. The guy turned back. 2 brown appendages were attached to his back, and he thought in surprise that these were nano wings. The wings spread over Aang. The wind blew in his direction, blowing the guy back to the stone standing behind. The main character crashed his back into a stone. He raised his hand, looking at her, and thought that when the nano wings disappear, they turn into weapons. In the hand of the main character, a dagger was formed from orange pixels, through which orange lightning bolts passed. Aang clutched the dagger in his hand in surprise, looking at it and thought that they have nanotechnology, and this is great progress in 60 years. A group of 4 fighters stood behind a stone. Sidu Liu turned to the others and asked if they were ready. Lan Sinuo and Suiju Yaohui looked out from behind the stone, answering that they were ready. In front of the stone behind which they were hiding, 2 low-rank demons, green and red, were sitting on the field. Sidu Liu said that their target was 2 low-rank demons and she would finish them off with one blow. The white-haired girl frowned and yelled for them to move along. All 4 ran out from behind the stone and ran forward. Lan Xinhua was running in front, frowning, his eyes glowing with a yellow light. Next to him was Suiju Yaohui with a smile on her face. Aang, and behind everyone, Sidu Liu jumped over the stone. The 2 low-ranking demons looked at the soldiers, their red eyes glowing. They opened their fanged maws, snarling at the fighters before them. Sidu Liu frowned, biting her lip, a green light emanating from her body. The girl thought that they still needed to complete 3 class tasks. And they couldn't mess around here, they would get down to business. She thought that Lan Xinhua would block their vision first. The guy suddenly stepped with his foot into the ground, leaving cracks there, while the demon was reaching out to him with its paw from above. Lan Xinhua jumped up and swung his leg, bringing out the ground in front of him, which formed a slide. The red demon's kick went through it, leaving a red trail behind it. 2 demons stood on the top of the mountain. There was no one around them, fog was flying in the air. Sidu Liu sat in front of the chessboard. There were 2 black demon pieces marked with crosses. Between them was the Lan Xinhua piece. The girl was holding the Aang and Suiju Yaohui pieces. She thought that now it was their turn to immobilize them together. Aang ran towards the red demon, who was looking at him with his mouth open. On the other side, Suiju Yaohui was running towards the green demon, while the demon swung his paw at the girl. The girl with pink hair frowned and raised her hand behind her, a green light shining next to her. Aang put his hand out in front of him, swinging to strike, with a red light shining next to him. Together they ran behind the demons, clutching daggers in their hands. Rays from their blows passed along the demons' legs, blue for the green demon and red for the red demon. Aang turned his gaze towards them and thought that they would watch them run after they cut their joints. The 2 demons opened their mouths and fell to their knees, kicking up dust from the ground under their feet. They bowed their heads low. Lan Xinhua stood in front of them, clenching his hand into a fist and holding it behind his back. The guy was surrounded by a yellow light when he thought it was time to test his blow. The guy sharply hit the jaws of one and the second demon with both fists, causing drops of green blood to fly out of their mouths. Lan Xinhua jumped, throwing the demons back, and they fell on their backs. Falling, Sidu Liu ran towards them, clutching a dagger in her hand. The girl with white hair raised the dagger high above her. It left a green glow behind it. She frowned and thought that she would finally end this fight quickly and gracefully. A bright beam of light passed between them across the bodies of the demons who were kneeling. Sidu Liu landed on the ground between the demons. Landing on one knee, she lowered her head low, stabbing her dagger into the ground. The inscription, Toxin Overload. The bodies of both demons were swollen. Green liquid was visible inside. The veins in that place were swollen. Sidu Liu stood between 2 green explosions, straightened up. She thought that this time they had finished everything brilliantly again. The fog was clearing. Trees and the orange sunset sky were visible. Suiju Yaohui stood in front of the capsule containing the black stone and smiled. Leaning over, she said that the fog was dissipating and the device was working stably. Lan Xinhua wiped the sweat from his forehead with his hand and lowered his gaze, saying that they had finally succeeded. And the task of dispersing the fog in the wasteland was much more difficult than in the test, and it was a suitable difficulty for a class A task. It took them so long to complete it. Suiju Yaohui moved the remaining remains of the demon aside with a stick. Between them lay a large red core, and the girl said that when they exploded, they left the core. She took it in her hand and raised it above her with a wide smile, examining it, saying that it was great. Everyone else looked at her. Sidu Liu closed her eyes and thanked everyone for their cooperation, saying that here were their 10 points. Aang held the task sheets in his hands, watching as one of them dissolved, and said that completed tasks were automatically destroyed and clearly high technology. The pink-haired girl smiled and explained that points were currently scored for demons destroyed, and the tablet system was directly linked to the score leaderboard. The sheet with Tasca and the rating table, which were united by a dotted line. Between them the arrows pointed at each other. The girl continued that after finishing the task, the points table in the tablet automatically makes calculations. Suiju Yaohui approached Aang and extended her hand to the task sheets, saying that they had just completed the task of dispelling the fog on the outskirts of the city, and asked to give her the sheets, to see what was left. The girl looked at 2 pieces of paper, raising her eyebrows. In one of the tasks there was a drawing of a demon and the number 3. At the bottom it was written to capture 3 lower-ranking demons alive. On the second one, a red core and the number 10 were drawn. On the bottom it was written to collect 10 cores of lower-rank demons. Suiju Yaohui said that it seems that the most difficult one remains. The upset girl fell to her knees on the ground and lowered her head, saying that they have 3 cores from the demons that they destroyed all day, and there are still 7 left, and capturing the demons alive is the most difficult thing. Lan Sinuo laughed, looking at her, and said that it looks like this time everything is not so simple, and while they were completing the mission, other groups were also busy with their tasks. Sidu Liu stood in front of the rest of the group and looked at them and said that they would now talk about their next course of action. The white-haired girl frowned and told them that they would finish doing 2 class missions and then continue doing other class tasks to get ahead. She crossed her arms and blushed while Suiju Yaohui photographed her with a smile, saying that she was so cool and really on fire. And Lan Sinuo clenched his hands into fists and said with fire in his eyes that they would quickly move forward and would not let anyone underestimate them team. Lan Sinuo asked what Brother Ang thought about this. Ang smiled and closed his eyes, saying that there is no need to be so distant and it's okay to just Ang. The main character smiled and stretched his hand, closing one eye. He said that otherwise they are right. Other teams are also diligently gaining points. If they don't hurry up, they don't get the required number of points, and those who get up early always get what they deserve, and they won't be able to do anything if they stand on the sidelines and watch. The main character exhaled and turned his head to the side, saying that he really thought that nothing could penetrate his heart, which had already been through so much. He closed his eyes and smiled, remembering the photo of them together and how they passed the entrance test, thinking that who would have thought that despite the fact that they were so young, their determination and perseverance inspired him so much. Aang adjusted his glove on his hand with a smile and said that they could finish one more task before sunset. Aang, Lan Sinuo and Suiju Yaohui walked forward. The girl with pink hair happily jumped up, saying go ahead. Sidu Liu looked at them with her hands on her hips, mentally displeasedly asking who allowed him to steal her idea with an inspirational speech. In front of them the sun was setting behind horizon, making only the silhouettes of the team visible. Birds flew in the sky, the orange sunset sun shone brightly, the sky turned orange. Lan Sinuo sat on one of the demons, resting his foot on its head and tied its mouth with a white cloth. Pulling it, he said that he had finished tying this one up. The guy stretched his shoulder, looking at the 3 tied demons lying in front of them, saying that they had caught them. Suiju Yaohui stood in front of one, taking pictures of everything, and Aang leaned down looking at one of the demons. Sidu Liu held the gun in her hands, frowned and pouted, thinking that the tranquilizer darts for catching low-rank demons were almost out and each team didn't have much special ammunition. The girl turned around, looking at Aang, who looked at her questioningly with raised eyebrows. She sighed and raised the pistol, saying that he needed to chew everything and that it was also a product of nanotechnology, a tranquilizer gun and a bayonet for killing demons in one bottle, and was suitable for beginners and was located next to nano wings, although the functions of synthesis and use were more intricate. Aang crouched near the muzzle of one of the demons and put his hand to his chin, thinking that the demons they had now captured were already passed out. He closed his eyes, remembering how in his old body he smiled awkwardly, standing in front of a bunch of demons with his eyes closed and beatings on his body. A scientist was kneeling next to him. The guy thought that before they could immobilize the demon just by punching him, and the researchers always complained that they beat up these demons too much. Lan Sinuo looked at the guy and girl with white hair, smiling and putting his hands on his hips, saying that now that the demons are unconscious, they can begin transporting them, and the task has been successfully completed. A group of 4 fighters stood in the middle of a field where dozens of dead demons lay. The guy continued that they had to destroy such a group of demons in order to capture 3, and there were several dozen of them. Suiju Yaohui stretched, raising her hands high and closing her eyes. She said that all the warriors need to return to the city before sunset, and they will be strictly reprimanded for being late. The girl opened one eye and smiled, her face illuminated by the setting sun. She said that they could return home for dinner. Aang looked at the girl in surprise, thinking about the house and the fact that he didn't even know if he had a current home in this world. Sidu Liu held the device in her hands, closing one eye and looking at it, said that she also needs to return early and they will set up beacons for the research personnel. They will come and take these demons, and this is the end of their task. Aang turned towards the girl, asking if they had a strange feeling, but before he could finish speaking, a red beam of light flew between them. The bullet flew through the corpses of the demons that were lying on the ground. It left behind a bright red light, making huge holes in the demons' bodies, from which green drops of blood flew. Aang turned back, his yellow eyes leaving a streak of light. Sidu Liu froze, holding the device in her hands, looking forward with a shocked look. A dead demon lying on the ground, holes visible in its jaw and tongue, a pool of blood forming under its head. A dark gun whose barrel was locked by a golden mechanism. Someone said they shouldn't have taken this mission. The three monsters that the group had tied up were lying dead. White smoke was emanating from the holes in their heads. Suiju Yaohui and Lan Sinuo asked in unison who it was, turning around. There was a guy sitting on a tree branch, two more standing on a rock, and between them sat a guy with red hair, who said that they were the rookie squad that took all the class emissions. The guy with red hair raised an eyebrow, a massive expression on his face. Black Mask, he said that they had to carry out this task and who allowed them to take someone else's. Aang frowned at them and asked who he was. The guy with red hair held a huge pistol in front of him, with a red cap on it, saying that they are the squad that Captain Jai Yaeding took under the command of in the last test, and they are called snipers. He took the weapon in his second hand while sitting in front of the group with the main character, and said that they were their predecessors, one of the 9 other units. A girl with long black hair leaned towards him with a smile. The guy asked how many units this time Captain Jai Yaeding took under his command. The girl answered that it was 3. The guy answered that means 3. Aang, Suiju Yaohui and Lan Sinuo frowned at the guy while he said that they, newcomers, did not seem to know the local rules and did not show them due respect, and it was impolite. The group jumped off the rock, landing on their feet on the ground. They went to the Sidu Liu group. The fat guy made the ground crack under their feet. The guy with red hair leaned over and said that without consulting with the elders, how can you take away all the tasks from class of the group of a guy with short blonde hair with a red core and chest, a fat guy with white glasses on his face with an orange stripe and a yellow core in his chest, a girl with long black hair, a yellow B rim and a blue core in his chest, and a guy with red hair, a mask on his face and a red core in his chest. He raised his hand and asked if it seemed to them that they were brazenly taking advantage of their kindness. Sidu Liu silently looked at the dead demon they had tied up, with bullet holes and a pool of blood visible underneath. The girl's eyes glowed blue and she raised her eyebrows with a gloomy face. The white-haired girl trembled with anger and clenched her teeth, thinking that they had worked so hard to catch this demon. A guy with red hair and a mask on his face looked at them, asking who was in charge in their squad, and he didn't even know how to address them. Sidu Liu ran forward towards him, with anger on her face, her body glowing green. She sharply kicked the guy, turning around, and he staggered to the side, dodging the blow. The guy with red hair stepped aside, frowning, and shouted how she behaves with elders and how ill-mannered they are. The girl with white hair put her fist behind her back, looking at the guy with displeasure, and shouted that they still call themselves the older generation of warriors. Lan Sinuo grabbed the girl by the hand, and Suiju Yaohui hugged her legs. Holding her, the guy worriedly told her not to start, and they are senior in rank, they need to talk to them first. Suiju Yaohui opened one eye, frowned, and demanded that they explain what they forgot here and how they could just shoot the demon they had been capturing for so long. The guy with red hair raised an eyebrow at her and asked why they were here. His eyes widened and turned red as he shouted that competition was their reason, or they were that simple-minded. Sidu Liu clenched her other hand into a fist, which the guy was not holding. It trembled, and bright green energy appeared around the girl when she asked about the simple-minded. In her mind, she screamed in rage that they had sabotaged their mission, and they had spent so much effort on her, and also doubted her authority as a leader. She would not give it up so easily. Lan Sinuo held the girl by the shoulders, who was trembling with anger, and turned back, calling Aang and saying that it was already sunset and let him talk to them. Before he could finish speaking, Aang rushed past Lan Sinuo and Sidu Liu, his eyes glowing with a bright red light. The main character jumped over the guy with red hair and clenched his hands into fists, sending him flying. He sharply kicked the guy in the face, bending down, and the guy with red hair flew back, the mask falling off his face. The rest of the group of elders worriedly called out to the captain, who was falling to the ground. Aang got to his feet and frowned, said that they were organizing hazing and had never heard such nonsense. And do they have any idea how much time they spent catching these 3 demons? The main character thought what a stupid rule, and in his life he had never talked about such a thing heard. Lan Sinuo looked at him in shock with his mouth wide open. Suiju Yaohui frowned in surprise. Her eyes widened, and Sidu Liu smiled contentedly, giving the guy a thumbs up. The guy with red hair sat on the ground and trembled, covering his face with his palm, muttering about how he dare treat his elders like that. He frowned, removing his hand from his face. There were many scars on his face near his mouth. He angrily shouted for the snipers to prepare for battle. The others shouted that they understood the order. A blonde with short hair was holding a knife with red lightning around it. A guy with white glasses was running forward, and a girl with black hair was holding a black dagger with blue lightning around it. Sidulu waved her hand with a dagger, saying that they would fight to the end. The main character stood in front of her. His yellow eyes glowed and he smiled. The two groups ran towards each other, holding daggers. The eyes of the guy with red hair and Aang glowed red, leaving a streak of red light behind them. Someone shouted loudly what they had done, and Jai Yaedeng appeared in front of the two guys, with red lightning flying around him. He grabbed the red-haired guy's hand and Aang's leg that the guy was about to hit with, stopping them. The man lowered his head, his eyes glowing yellow, emitting lightning. The captain sharply threw the two guys in different directions and they flew back with their arms outstretched. The red-haired guy landed on one knee, frowning and gritting his teeth as Sidulu looked at him in surprise. Aang also landed on one knee, resting his hand on the ground and smiled, thinking that it looks like there won't be a fight today and he would look at the level of the current generation of warriors. Jai Yaedeng stood with his back to them, his hands clenched into fists, red mist emanating from him. Someone shouted that it was the captain and the man turned around. He frowned and clenched his teeth in anger, saying that they were brainless brats and wanted to become a snack for demons, since they were rampaging here at sunset. The guy with red hair pointed at Sidulu, Lan Sinuo and Suiju Yaohui, saying that they were the ones who started it and took his mask. Sidulu put her hands on her hips and calmly looked at him, asking why he was complaining like a child. The guy clenched his teeth in anger, his hands trembled. The girl with pink hair pointed in his direction with a determined look and said that she had photographic evidence, and they were the first to kill 3 demons, whom they took alive and are now brazenly complaining. Lan Sinuo looked at her in surprise, his mouth open, and asked when she had time. Jai Yaedeng looked at them, asking that they had captured them alive and they were carrying out a class mission. The girl with white hair put her hands behind her back and straightened up, saying that she was reporting that the mission was almost completed, but at the last moment, the sniper squad sabotaged it. The captain closed his eyes and lowered his head, saying that he understood. He stood in front of the 3 people from the Sidulu group and the guy with red hair while the others stood behind and said that they might think the snipers were overdoing it, but they went through the same thing when they were newbies. Sidulu calmly looked at the captain while he said that how to deal with this was up to them. The man frowned. A large list appeared behind him, some icons of which were marked in red. Jai Yaedeng said that in the end, squads are judged on their points and except for intentionally causing harm and endangering life, everything is allowed and each city has its own rules. Sidulu, Lan Sinuo and Suiju Yaohui looked at the captain with serious faces while he said that as warriors, they would face more dangerous situations, and then he would no longer be able to separate them. The sun was setting behind the horizon. Dust was flying in the air. The captain said that he was interfering not because he was against their showdown, but because it was already sunset and they still needed to return to the city. Jai Yaedeng turned to the guy with red hair and said that the rookie squad took away all the class tasks from them and even defeated them in battle, and he was ashamed of him. He advised them to change their attitude towards the service. The guy replied that he understood. He turned away from the captain and walked towards his group. Aang looked at him. The guy with red hair called the main character, looked at him and said that he never identified himself. Aang frowned at the guy and looked at him from under his brows, saying that he was Aang. The red-haired guy's eyes turned red and he looked at him in surprise. He turned to his group and pointed his finger at the main character, laughing loudly and saying, "Have they heard? And he is called as the strongest warrior of humanity." Aang thought that he himself asked. The guy with red hair walked past the guy with black hair with his hands in his pockets and said that they won't give them a point. He promises. He gritted his teeth as he walked forward with an angry look, white energy around him as he said that their squad would be the worst this month. The guy stopped at his mask, which was lying on the ground. He pointed to his cheek, smiling, where Aang had left a mark from his kick and said that he would repay it doubly later. The guy with red hair picked up his mask from the ground. He put it on his face, closed his eyes and called out to a group of snipers. The guy told them to leave. Everyone from the group jumped in different directions and disappeared while Aang watched them go. Jai Yaedeng thought about a group of snipers. Behind him were their silhouettes. He said that snipers may not be the strongest squad, but they are known for their dexterity, and they will do everything possible to put a spoke in their wheels when completing missions. He remembered a guy with red hair who held 2 guns in 2 hands. He raised one up, red lightning sparkled around it, and inserted the second into the demon's mouth. The guy's eyes glowed red. Jiaedeng said that their captain's specialty was gunfire weapon, and he had not yet used his weapon in their mess. Sidu Liu frowned, looking away as the captain said that he admitted they were good for beginners, but there were other talented warriors, and even if they gave it their all, they might not be strong enough to fight him. The man walked back from the group. Aang stood further from everyone, looking at the captain. The man said that it was time to return to the city. Sidu Liu closed her eyes and told them to go back. She thought how it happened. The girl looked at the main character, talking about the trick he pulled and he was showing off or something. The girl with white hair turned forward, her white hair fluttering in the wind. She said that it looked cool nonetheless. Aang looked after the girl in surprise. He stretched while Lan Sinuo stood next to him, asking if he would go home for dinner. The guy said that he had plans for the evening. The guy asked what, if not a secret. Aang hit his palm with his fist and walked somewhere. His yellow eyes glowed and he smiled, thinking that tonight he would get them 3 demons. The moon was shining brightly in the sky, the city walls, behind which the fog was visible. The loudspeaker repeated the phrase that for safety reasons one should not leave the city. A red beam of light flashed along the road to the boxes standing near the exit beyond the city walls. The main character was squatting, looking around the corner and thought that on the way to the gate from the city there were only electric sirens and almost no people. And so late in a closed city he needed to stay at home. He would like to return home when he finished. The guy put his hand on the edge of the box, frowning and thought that it seemed the gate was not so well guarded. Near the entrance there was a yellow sign with the inscription Temporary Emergency Exit. Exit is prohibited. A shadow fell on it from the main character, who thought that there were only warnings and no people around at all. Aang squatted down at the sign, looking at it and thought that maybe it was because no one would think of leaving the city at night. And it was strange to leave the exit open. He thought that before they didn't care about the time of day, and sometimes they even specially arranged night forays. The guy put his hand to his face and narrowed his eyes, thinking that after all, demons are very easy to find at night and he uses his old trick. Catching these 3 demons will not be a problem. Aang smiled, slamming his fist on his palm and thought about the sniper team, thinking that this guy in a poppy was determined to interfere with their team, and then he would just unexpectedly finish the task. And what a genius he was. Someone said that of course this is so, and the main character flinched, making a frightened sound. Sidu Liu stood near the wall with her arms crossed on her chest, and the guy loudly called her name. The girl mentally smiled widely and thought how exciting, and a night walk was so exciting. She thought that she had so much freedom after becoming a warrior, and she could get out of the house for any reason. And during the day she heard Aang talking about some plans, and immediately realized that he had something planned for the night. The main character rose to his feet, holding his knees, and said that she scared him. The girl looked at him, asking what he forgot here at night, and was trying to go out the gate. She mentally smiled and blushed, thinking that she was really looking forward to seeing the night outside the gate. Aang pouted his lips and looked away. He awkwardly scratched his cheek and was sweating heavily when he said that he didn't understand what she was talking about, and he just went out for a walk after a heavy dinner. Inscription: although Aang was the strongest warrior in the past, but sometimes he's still slow to think. The guy lowered his head while Sidu Liu calmly looked at him, thinking that he was a lousy liar. The main character closed his eyes, awkwardly ruffled his hair, and said that in fact, he was thinking about giving them a surprise tomorrow and he just wanted to complete the task that night, which was sabotaged by the team of that guy in the mask, and there is still time to complete it. The guy walked forward from the girl who was standing against the wall, and turning to her, said that since she caught him, nothing could be done. He asked not to inform the captain, and he would go back. Sidu Liu stood against the wall, looking after the guy, and said that she would go with him. The main character's eyes widened in surprise. The girl smiled at him, blushing slightly, and asked what the plan was. She thought that she was right and she was so smart. It would be so much fun. The girl thought that being a warrior was really cool, and how she could imagine the sour minds of this masked guy's squad. Already goosebumps. Aang looked at her in shock, opening his mouth wide, and asked if she was joking. The girl answered in the negative. The city walls, behind Sidu Liu, 2 fighters were sitting on the edge of the wall. One of them was eating rice with chopsticks, and the second with short black hair was yawning with his eyes closed. The guy with short hair put his head on his palm and said tiredly that every time he stands on duty, it's such torture and it's mortally boring. And who in their right mind would go out of the city at night? Only crazy people, he asked. It's not enough to just close a gate or something. The man who was sitting next to him put a finger to his lips and, frowning, hissed at the guy, saying that he was a fool and should not dare say such things in front of the captain of the 3rd squad, and the doors were left for emergencies. He remembered how 3 people fled from demons at night, but the doors to the city were closed. The man said that several years ago a bunch of deserters were looking for help in their city, and due to the fact that the gates slowly opened, they were torn to pieces by demons. 3 demons stood at the gate. One of the demons was dragging a dead man back by the head. Behind them a dense fog was visible, in which many red eyes shone. The doors to the city were slightly open. The man explained that after that incident, almost every city now leaves an emergency exit at the gate, and in their world survival is most important. The guy with black hair folded his hands and lowered his head, apologizing. The man reached behind his back, saying that everything was fine and with time he would get used to it. The man showed the guy a magazine that had a photograph of a girl in an unbuttoned shirt lying on the sand next to the sea. The man told him to look at what he had. A guy with short hair, blushing, held a pink magazine, which had a large 18+ mark on it. He said that this was the latest issue of a magazine about warriors from other cities. The man looked at him, said that he paid good money to get it and he would give it and other guys for today. 2 guys, blushing and smiling, looked at the magazine. Sitting on the wall, the guy said that he couldn't believe that he managed to get the latest issue. The other man replied to look here, and this waste. Aang and Sidu Liu ran outside the city on the ground, the core in the girl's chest, and her eyes glowed brightly with green light. Aang looked at the large round fields surrounded by trees and thought that they were undergoing a test here, and the fog was thicker at night than during the day. The guy pointed his thumb to the side, telling them to go there. The girl turned to him. The city wall, in front of which there was a dense forest, a red icon to the left of the test site, showed the location of Sidu Liu and the main character. Sidu Liu and Aang stood in the middle of the scorched earth, from which dry broken trees sprouted. The guy said that they were there. The girl looked at the field and said that they need to position themselves away from the city walls in order to remain unnoticed, and the dead forest will also provide good cover. Aang looked back over his shoulder, his yellow eyes glowing. He said that they were going according to plan, and while he was luring the demons out, she would strike them on the head and they would knock them out with brute force, and that would be enough. The guy walked further between the trees. A dense fog was flying around him. He told her to wait for him here. The guy disappeared into the fog. Sidu Liu's hands trembled as she thought that even though Aang looked confident, it was difficult to walk alone into the forest shrouded in fog. The girl hunched over, her body glowing green. She clenched her hand into a fist, thinking that she was also good. Alone at night in the forest outside the city walls, and it seemed as if she was about to be swallowed up by fog and darkness. Sidu Liu exhaled loudly, opening her mouth and thinking that she was scared and anxious, but she needed to concentrate. She frowned, pursing her lips, her blue eyes giving off a faint light as she thought that she needed to help him at any moment. Away Aang skillfully lured out the demons, surprised Sidu Liu. The huge demon opened its mouth, trying to devour the main character, who jumped back from him. And since Aang caught lower-ranking demons one at a time, this made catching them a lot easier. The guy landed with his feet on a tree, leaning his hand on it. If we talk about Sidu Liu, then this method of catching demons with live bait seemed very original and interesting to her. Over time she got used to it and got involved in the process. Aang frowned and turned back over his shoulder and loudly called Sidu Liu. The girl said that she understood and ran forward while the huge demon threw the trees to the sides with its paws, opening its mouth wide. Aang pushed off the tree with his feet, while at the same time Sidu Liu also pushed off from the ground. The guy struck the demon's mouth while the girl kicked him in the jaw, drops of green blood flying out of the demon's mouth. Under Aang's command, they looked like they were playing with these low-ranking demons. Sidu Liu jumped over the demon's huge paw, dodging the strike as Aang punched one of the demons in the face. At the same time, they struck the demon in the head over and over again, and with each blow he became more and more uncoordinated. Sidu Liu stood at the demon, giving a thumbs up to Aang, who was sitting on the monster's head with a smile, giving the girl a thumbs up in response. That night, a trick forgotten half a century ago to capture demons was played out again. The main character and the girl struck with their elbows another red-skinned demon, striking from both sides, drops of blood flying out of its mouth. But despite the smoothness of the process, this method of capturing demons still required a lot of physical strength. Sidu Liu was sitting next to one of the demons. Aang was sitting next to another demon, tying his mouth, and a green demon was lying tied up next to him. The main character wiped the sweat from his face with his hand. Drops of sweat flowed down his cheek, and he thought that this body still needs to be trained, and in the past he caught lower-ranking demons once or twice. A girl with white hair pulled another demon by the mouth. Drops of sweat were also running down her face. She said that they had finally caught the third. The girl thought. as she was exhausted and it was much more difficult than the usual physical training at their home. The guy told her to leave the demon here. The girl raised her eyebrows, looking questioningly at the guy, and asked him to just leave him here. Aang looked at the girl. Around them there were gray trees and 3 demons lying on the ground. He said that demons of the lower ranks are quite stupid, and they will not understand how to help a relative, and besides, they do not like to approach the walls of the city, and so they can leave these 3 here without any problems. The main character with a smile patted the demon's face with his palm and said that after such a head injury from being captured, they would not be able to wake up for a long time, and they would just come here tomorrow morning and finish their task. Sidu Liu looked at him and then calmly asked how he knew so much. Drops of sweat were running down Aang's face and he smiled awkwardly, thinking that he had said too much. A voice came from above that said what he had found. Aang and Sidu Liu raised their heads to the tree branches. Their eyes widened in shock as they looked up. Above them on the tree sat 2 demons of the first rank. One of them had blue eyes throughout his body, and the second had red eyes. A demon with red eyes descended from the tree, saying that he had found a man. Another blue demon looked at them and said that he could actually smell it. Aang and Sidu Liu looked at the 2 demons. The girl's face was covered with drops of sweat, and she thought that these were first-rank demons. So there were 2 more. The main character frowned, looking at the demons and opening his mouth. He thought where the demons of the first rank came from. And now this is not at all useful. Why are these 2 here? Spotlights were lit on the towers of the city walls. Jai Yedeng, Joel and Dada Jio jumped onto the tower wall in front of the 2 guards. Joel clenched his hands into fists, looking at the 2 guards, and shouted about the report of a rank 1 demon and told them to turn on the spotlights. One of the guards was hiding a pink magazine behind his back. They both said they understood. Dada Jio looked at Jai Yedeng, asking what was happening, and the first-rank demon appeared again. And is it the same as during the test? The man frowned without looking at her and said that no, he found him in the cave, and should maybe he's already dead. The spotlight shone on the trees, where 2 demons of the first rank were sitting on one of them. One of the trainees shouted that the target had been found and there were 2 demons of the first rank, a demon with gray skin and red eyes on the body, and a demon with blue skin and blue eyes on the body. Joel frowned, thinking that there were 2 of them, and what were they doing there? He shouted not to panic and close the gates of the city. They would not harm them. He shouted to prepare defensive weapons. On one of the towers of the city wall there was a cannon, in the muzzle of which a yellow projectile was collected. With his mouth wide open, Captain Jai Yedeng shouted to stop and not close the gate. The girl with red hair turned to him, asking what happened, and the man replied that there seemed to be people there. Joel shouted to direct the spotlight. Jai Yedeng clenched his teeth in rage. His yellow eyes lit up and he angrily asked what those 2 fools had forgotten there. The spotlight illuminated the place under the tree where 2 demons were sitting, and Aang and Sidu Liu were standing on the ground. Dada Jio frowned and gritted her teeth, asking what those 2 forgot outside the city. The 3 captains watched as the spotlights illuminated the trees in the distance. The spotlight shone on the place where the 3 bound demons lay, and Jai Yedeng said that there were 3 lower-ranked demons bound with them. The man clenched his teeth and closed his eyes, saying that he understood everything and they wanted to complete the task of capturing the demons that had been thwarted during the day at night. Joel also gritted his teeth, frowned, and said that with slightly above average skills, it was easy to lose one's head, and they rushed to distinguish themselves, a standard problem for new recruits. Jai Yedeng crouched down to make a jump. His body was illuminated by red energy, and red lightning flashed from his eyes. He shouted that he would rip their heads off when all this was over. The man suddenly jumped from the wall, leaving behind a bright red light and throwing one of the guards back. The girl with red hair called Joel. She looked at the guy with a frown and shouted that she would also go to pull them out and hand over the command to him. Jai Yedeng and Dada Jio flew from the city wall, leaving a red light behind them, the red cores in their chests glowing. Joel looked down, where 2 red explosions went off next to the wall, and sighed, saying that such a night for drinking was ruined. One of the demons covered his face with his hand and said that they had been found. Aang covered Sidu Liu with his hand, looking at the demons and telling her to hide behind him, and they need to stall for time while they wait for help. The main character gritted his teeth, looking at the demons, and thought that it seemed they had come for him and they were the same first-rank demons as the one who was last time. He remembered the huge crater in the ground, thinking maybe it was because of his rebirth at that time, or because of what happened in that cave. The girl with white hair stepped forward, clenched her hands into fists, and said that they would fight together. The demon exhaled loudly, drool dripping from his fangs as he asked if they would resist. The 2 demons raised their hands and jumped from the gray tree. The blue demon landed by the tree with his head down as the gray demon disappeared from his spot. He appeared behind Aang and Sidu Liu, spreading his clawed paws to the sides. The gray-skinned demon raised his hand over Sidu Liu, clenched his teeth and said that they would kill the unnecessary one first. The main character jumped towards the girl, shouting at her to be careful, and Sidu Liu closed her eyes, flying to the side as the demon's paw descended between them. A bright red ray of light passed from the demon's hand, which crashed into the ground. A strong impulse from the blow passed through it. The stones split, and the guy and girl jumped away on different sides from the demon. The demon looked at Aang while the girl rode on the other side of him. The demon said that they have a quick reaction. The girl with white hair clenched her teeth and struck the demon with her foot, from which a green light emanated. She screamed at him to get out of here, but her foot was surrounded by water. Sidu Liu frowned. Drops of water fell next to her face and she realized that she had missed. The demon next to whom the girl's leg was grinned. Sidu Liu's leg was captured by blue threads. Sidu Liu looked up. Blue threads were tied to the fingers of a blue-skinned demon. He crossed his arms. His threads wrapped around the girl's legs, and he asked if she could see. The demon spread his arms to the sides and blue threads wrapped themselves all over the girl's body, causing her to throw back her head and scream. The guy shouted the girl's name and frowned at her. The demon looked at him, clenched his paw into a fist in front of the guy's chest and said that he was distracted and he needed to be on his guard. The fist slammed into the demon's face, leaving behind a red energy pulse. The captain pushed the demon aside, stood in front of Aang and shouted that he should not touch them. The demon fell next to another demon who was holding the girl. Jai Yadang and Dada Jio stood in front of Aang, and the captain clenched his hand into a fist, telling them not to worry and they were here. Aang looked ahead in surprise. The girl with red hair frowned and clenched her teeth, saying that there was a hybrid of a blue core with an aquatic core and a red core with an earthen core. She thought that first she needed to save Sidu Liu. The red demon lowered his head low. There were fragments of stones on his heads, a hybrid of red with earthen bonds. The blue demon held a girl in blue threads, a hybrid of blue core with water bonds. The red demon, stones fell from his face, and he said that it was a good defense and his head almost exploded. Joel frowned, wondering what they should do. He shouted that they were too close. The guy shouted to stop firing from the defensive guns and he couldn't hit his own people. The two guns on the walls of the tower went out. The girl with black hair ran to a guy with blue hair, calling him. She was breathing heavily, leaning on her knees and said that many demons of lower ranks had been spotted on the radar, and they were approaching them. Joel looked at her in surprise, asking how many there were according to the orientation. The girl shouted that she couldn't count. She braced herself on her knees, her body trembling and her eyes widened in horror as she said it was a wave of demons. The moon shone brightly in the sky and turned red. The stones on the ground trembled. There were many lesser demons running in the forest, their eyes glowing red. The huge demon behind them pushed trees aside. Another demon pushed off the ground, leaving a red light behind it. Others opened their mouths. Joel looked at the huge horde of demons who were running towards the city walls, the moon illuminating the sky with red light. The guy clenched his teeth, beads of sweat running down his face. He shouted to sound the alarm and put all the warriors in the city on alert. A huge horde of demons stood in front of the walls of the city, around which a bright red light burned. Bright red lights lit up on the walls of the city and an alarm was heard. One of the Yellow Corps soldiers clenched his teeth, saying that this was an alarm signal for a wave of demons. The soldiers ran to the city walls. Someone shouted to all the soldiers to head to the city walls. Aang and Jai Yaedang turned back, where there was a purple horde of demons. The captain said that this was a wave of demons and he had already prepared for the inevitable. But everything worked out. The main character said that they passed by their side and were going straight to the city. A girl with red hair, she gritted her teeth with her hair, looking to the side and said that most likely these two had called them and they needed to act as quickly as possible. Sidu Liu, who had blue threads around her, frowned, sweat dripping down her face as she screamed for them to leave her and go to the city to help. The girl thought that it was because of her that the captain and the others were in this situation and she set them up. The blue-skinned demon covered the girl's mouth with water, telling her not to scream, and Sidu Liu closed one eye. Jai Yaedang, Aang and Dada Jio ran forward. The captain extended his hand, his eyes glowing with golden light as he shouted to the demon to let her go. The gray-skinned demon placed his hands on the ground, which had red cracks running through it, and laughed loudly. Thorns sprouted from the ground, heading towards the captain and the girl with red hair. Veins popped out on the man's face and he frowned, shouting to Dada Jio to be careful. The captain and the girl jumped away from the thorns that were trying to pierce them. They swung their legs, breaking the thorns, while Aang looked questioningly at the thorns that did not hit him. He frowned as he looked back at them and wondered why the demon wasn't attacking him. A gray-skinned demon ran past the guy, laughing and telling him to wait. He rushed past the main character, scattering stones behind him, and ran towards the two captains. Jai Yedang gritted his teeth and looked to the side, wondering why the demon ignored Aang. The demon shouted that he would beat them to death. He struck many blows at the two captains, from whom red rays of light emanated. The blue-skinned demon kept his paw on the girl's shoulder and beckoned the guy with his finger, saying that he would come with them. Sidu Liu looked forward in surprise as she was pulled back, her eyes leaving a blue streak of light behind them. Aang shouted the girl's name as the demon on water wings carried her further into the forest, between the trees. He looked at the ground and clenched his hands into fists, thinking that it was a trap, and they shared him with the captain. It was obviously a trap. He told himself to remain calm and not get into trouble, remembering his first fight with a first-rank demon. Jai Yedang and Dada Jio looked at the guy. They both shouted at him not to follow him, and he couldn't handle it. Aang clenched his teeth and trembled, thinking about Sidu Liu. He remembered her frightened face and her mouth covered with water, thinking about that look. The guy remembered his former self and the many frightened looks of people who pulled their hands forward. Aang thought that this look was very familiar to him. The main character looked down, clenching his hand into a fist, which was trembling, and thought that he could not help but go after them. He frowned, looking ahead resolutely, and ran forward, thinking that he couldn't leave Sidu Liu alone. Fog and black particles flew between the trees. The girl with white hair sat on the ground, looking at the blue demon who stood in front of her. Her hands and feet were tied with blue threads, and her mouth was sealed with water. She frowned at the demon, who said that she was human, and that was interesting. A blue light was visible in the demon's mouth. A gray fog was flying around him as he said that they, demons of the first rank, are interested in what emotions they humans experience, and they say that when people are in despair, they can start screaming so loudly. The demon looked at the girl, opening his mouth, and told her to beg for mercy, and he wants to hear her beg for mercy. Sidu Liu looked at him silently, frowning. The demon reached out and tore the water from the girl's mouth with its claw, saying that that's why she was silent. He leaned towards her, extending his clawed paws, and told her to scream, begging for his mercy, while Sidu Liu silently looked at him. She clenched her teeth, looking at him angrily, and asked him to beg. The demon put his hand to his chin and tilted his head, sighing in surprise, and asked, "So there is no need to beg him?" Sidu Liu looked at him while sitting on the ground and remembered her clan. She said that she was born in a martial arts clan, and there she was taught to never bow her head to the enemy, and to show fear is cowardice, so either she will die from his clutches in captivity, or let him fight her again. The demon opened its mouth, from which a blue light emanated, and laughed. He swung his leg, hitting the girl in the face, causing her to stagger to the side, the demon screaming that he was angry. He looked at Sidu Liu, who was lying tied up on the ground, and said that she was just bait, and could be gotten rid of. Looking at him angrily, the girl clenched her teeth, and there were drops of red blood on her face. Someone called the demon who was approaching the girl, and he turned around. Aang stood among the fog, stretching out his hand with a dagger forward and clenching his teeth. He told the demon to let her go, and his target was him. Sidu Liu opened her eyes in surprise, wondering why the guy himself came here. The demon happily waved his arms and turned to the guy, shouting that he really came. The bait worked and he was his target. The girl looked at him, thinking that Aang was their target. But what does that mean, and why do they need him? Aang put his hand with a dagger in front of him and frowned at the girl, asking if everything was okay with her. She, lying face down on the ground, raised an eyebrow and shouted that she was fine, and why was he without reinforcements, and he couldn't defeat a first-rank demon. Let him leave. The blue demon hit the girl with his knee and she flew to the side. The demon loudly told her to shut up. Aang looked at the demon with anger, veins popping out on his face as he screamed for the demon not to touch her and if he was his target, then let him take him instead of her, asking him to let the girl go. The demon looked over his shoulder at him and chuckled, asking about the exchange. He quickly ran away from the girl towards the guy, leaving a blue trail behind him. The demon approached the protagonist's face and chuckled again, saying that they would all die. Aang swung his dagger sharply, delivering a blow that left a red trail behind it, but the demon dodged it. The demon struck the guy's hand with his hand, and he clenched his teeth and closed his eyes. The main character turned his gaze to the demon, his yellow eyes glowing and his hand trembling as he thought that this body was not at all capable of fending off such fast attacks. The demon jumped away from the guy, leaving a trail of water behind him, and said that he smelled like one of us and how curious it was. The demon dealt several blows with his paws, from which a blue light emanated and a trace of water was visible, and asked loudly why. Aang repelled the blows, leaving a red light behind the dagger, and thought that these were all water bombs, and over the last half-century the demons had developed a bunch of new ones' abilities. The guy clenched his teeth. There were many cuts on his cheeks from which drops of blood flowed. He thought that although he could come up with a plan of action, he would not be able to implement it. The girl watched the battle with her lips pursed. Splashes of water were visible nearby. She thought that things were bad, and if Aang died, then they would both be lost here, and he was such a fool. Why did he come alone? It's clear that he can't compete with a demon of the first rank. The girl was surprised to notice a sharp piece of stone sticking out of the ground. She began to crawl towards this stone. While ahead Aang and the demon were fighting each other, the girl thought that she needed to act. The main character blocked the demon's blow, which caused splashes of water, with his hand. He clutched a dagger in his second hand and pointed it at the demon's head. A bright red light came from it. Monies sparkled around the dagger, and the guy's eyes glowed with the same red light when he thought that now. The demon grabbed the guy by the hand that was holding the dagger. Water appeared around it. He said that in the cave Aang killed a demon of the first rank, and he cannot be so weak. The demon asked if he was faking, and Aang clenched his teeth, looking at the stream of water next to his face. He shouted that he had no idea what he was carrying or what demon he had killed. The demon looked at him, opening his mouth slightly, and said that he was rude and impolite, that he was bad and needed to be punished. The demon's paws twisted the guy's hands, and he threw his head back, clenching his teeth. The demon screamed to break. In the forest, between the trees, the loud cry of the main character was heard. The wind swirled. Black particles flew in the air. The demon raised his hand, and the guy flew into the air. The demon said that he was a liar. He sharply kicked the main character in the stomach, and his head dropped. The demon said that liars are killed. From the demon's kick, Aang flew back, knocking down several trees in his path with his body, and fell to the ground. Where the guy lay, dark smoke could be seen, and the demon looked at it, shouting for him to tell his secret, laughing madly. The main character was lying on the ground, in the middle of a dark fog. Blood was running down his lips, and his eyes were clouded. He thought that he was in a lot of pain, and as if he had touched his internal organs. He thought that he had really come to the point that a demon was making fun of him first rank. Sidu Liu sat on the ground, cutting the blue threads with a stone. Blood was visible on her wrists. She looked towards the guy, thinking that she needed to act faster. The blue demon walked towards the guy. There were broken trees nearby. He said that he would not admit everything, and he would kill him and then eat him. The demon licked his lips with a smile and said that he thought the guy would help him evolve. The demon extended his hand to the guy who was lying on the ground and told him to come here. Suddenly, a dagger appeared next to the demon's head, casting a green light. The demon ducked his head, dodging Sidu Liu's strike as she gritted her teeth as her strike left a long green light behind it. She kicked the demon away with her foot, jumping in front of him. Standing on the demon's chest with both feet, the girl pushed away from him. She flipped in the air, throwing the demon aside and spreading her arms out to her sides. The girl landed on the ground, lowering her head and stabbing the dagger she was holding in her hand into the ground. She looked at the demon, clenching her teeth, her eyes glowing green. Sidu Liu stood in front of Aang, saying that she would not let her comrade be offended. The demon said that who would have thought that the girl would free herself. She stood with an evil face, holding a dagger in one hand, dark fog flying around her. Aang opened his eyes slightly, thinking about the girl. Blood flowing down his lips. He watched as she stood holding a dagger in front of her. Blood was visible on the girl's wrists and legs. Aang thought that she had forcibly torn off the bonds from her wrists and ankles, and she was so strong. Sidu Liu frowned, her eyes glowing green as she said that the demon was going to kill her squad member and let him deal with her first. Water splashes appeared around the demon, and he agreed, looking at the girl. Thin, sharp blue spikes emerged from his body. He spread his arms to the sides, and many thorns flew towards the girl and the guy lying on the ground. The demon said that now she would not be able to escape. Sidu Liu looked in shock at the many thorns that were flying towards her, her eyes wide. Standing in front of the guy, Sidu Liu fought off the thorns with her dagger, leaving yellow and green light from the blows. The thorns fell in front of the protagonist, who looked at the girl, weakly telling her to dodge. The girl frowned, watching the thorns and quickly waving her hand to fight them off, saying that they would then hit him. So let the guy be silent, she mentally cursed, thinking that there were too many of them. The blue demon extended his hand, pointing the spikes forward, and told the girl to be careful with her feet. Several spikes rose near the girl's feet and headed towards them. Suddenly, several spikes extended out, piercing Sidu Liu from the back, and she let out a cry of pain as she rose off the ground. The demon clenched his hand into a fist, telling the girl to come to him, and the thorns pulled Sidu Liu towards him. The demon grabbed her by the throat, asking if she wanted to die in battle. The demon lifted her above him. A trail of water came from his hand, and Aang lay to the side. The demon said that he would not just kill her, but tear her apart. The demon smiled, telling her that now he would definitely make her scream. Aang opened his eyes slightly, looking at how the blue demon held Sidu Liu by the neck, lifting it up. He looked at it with a dull gaze while lying on the ground and faintly thought for the demon to let Sidu Liu go. The guy's hands trembled as he tried to get up from the ground, and he thought that even after being reborn, he was again forced to watch the members of his squad die. And nothing had changed. Which of him was the strongest warrior, if in the end he couldn't even save one girl? The core on the guy's chest began to crumble and crack, and he thought that if he couldn't even help himself, then what to say about the others? Aang hit the ground with his fist and clenched his teeth. A red light surrounded his eyes and body, and an impulse passed through the ground. He thought that at least let him not force her to watch him kill her, and he couldn't even do anything. The blue demon turned back, where powerful dark red energy was emanating from the guy. He looked over his shoulder, holding the girl by the neck. A stream of dark red energy flashed in front of the demon, and the demon's hand that was holding the girl recoiled back. Aang held Sidu Liu in his arms, landing on the ground and lowering his head as the demon looked at them. The demon looked at the guy in surprise, his mouth open, cuts ran down his arm, and blood flowed out of them, when he thought that it didn't look like the guy had attacked him and it was the wind or something. Aang looked at Sidu Liu, who had blue spikes stuck into her body and blood dripping from her forehead. He told her that she did great for her first time as team captain. The girl looked at the guy with a dull look, half-closed eyes, and asked Aang if it was him. The main character looked at her, one of his eyes turned red, and he asked the girl to leave the rest to him. He lowered the girl to the ground while the demon watched his back, standing in front of him. He opened his mouth, the blue eyes on his body glowing as he said that his aura was so strong and this was his secret. The main character walked away from the girl, heading towards the demon, while a red aura surrounded his body. He said that he didn't really understand what had happened. The guy looked away, putting his hand on his head, and thought that he felt that from the inside, it was becoming stronger. He closed his red eye, frowning, and thought that something was about to tear it apart. Suddenly, he raised his head and screamed. Behind him, a powerful dark red energy formed into a terrifying face. Red energy gathered around the socket where the red core had previously been inserted. On a white background, there was a symbol with a black stripe and two lines extending on either side. The demon opened his mouth looking at it and said that this is the core and it is like that of the Demon King. Sidu Liu turned her head towards the guy, opened her eyes slightly and thought about the guy. Aang held out his hand as he was surrounded by red energy and said that he knew one thing. A red horn appeared on the guy's forehead and part of his forehead turned red. His hand also turned red and demonic. His face contorted in anger as he said he knew the demon needed to die. Aang, the single fin form awakening. Jai Yedeng and Dada Jio jumped away from the spikes in the ground that the gray-skinned demon had summoned. Suddenly strong impulses passed through the air, and the demon raised his head in surprise. He looked between the trees, where nothing was visible, and was surprised to think that the aura was so strong that his head was spinning, and was it really one of them? Jai Yedeng appeared next to the demon. The man clenched his hand into a fist, his yellow eyes throwing off sparks as he screamed for the demon to look at him. The man slammed his fist into the demon's chest, knocking him back. The man's blow sent a strong impulse that dispersed the fog behind the demon. Dada Jio jumped above the demon, bending her legs. Straightening them sharply, she kicked the demon in the face, causing the demon to bleed green. He fell, breaking several trees with his body, the girl with red hair landing on the ground in front of him. She jumped forward towards the demon, dodging broken trees. The gray-skinned demon leaned against a tree. With his head down, he muttered that they were strong and could not be countered. Jai Yedeng and Dada Jio ran up to the demon. The man's eyes cast a golden light, and the girl's eyes were blue. The two captains simultaneously hit the demon, Dada Jio with his foot and Jai Yedeng with his fist. The red core from the demon's body flew back, leaving a round hole in his back. The core broke and a large bright beam of light came from it. The demon flew up from the two captains, arms outstretched. Green blood flowed from a huge hole in his chest, and he asked how they dared to just rip the core out of him. A red core appeared inside the demon's chest, with a black mark in the middle. Dada Jio covered her head with her hand and looked up, telling Jai Yedeng to be careful, and that the demon was about to explode. The man asked what she was suggesting, to cover herself with the earth or something. The demon flew high up. His body was illuminated by a red light that came from the core in his chest, and he said that they would all die together. Suddenly, a bright yellow beam of light pierced the demon. He began to fall, a bright beam of light trailing behind him. A huge arrow was stuck into the ground while the demon hung on it. cursing at the people, dark fog flying around. Jai Yaedeng looked back at the demon while the red-haired girl looked forward. She said that these were defense weapons. Near the city walls, soldiers were fighting demons, and cannons were visible on the towers. Joel cut one of the demons in half with a dagger, from the blow of which a blue light passed through. The guy's eyes glowed with a purple light. He knelt down on one knee, sliding across the ground, his dagger clinging to the ground as the horde of demons headed towards the city walls. The guy with blue hair clenched his teeth, frowned, and thought that there were too many of them and they weren't ending at all. His eyes widened and he screamed loudly, waves of blue energy emanating from Joel as he told everyone to return to the city until the wave of demons passed. Joel called the other two captains from the wall, and they turned around. The demons were climbing the wall one after another. Dada Jio said that they needed to return to the city, and they were needed there. Jai Yaedeng silently looked towards the walls, pursing his lips, and then asked what they should do with Aang and Sidu Liu then. The red-haired girl lowered her head as she stood opposite the captain, her face hidden in shadow as she said that she wanted to help them too. But they weren't just squad captains. She frowned, looking at the man, and clenched her hands into fists, saying that first of all they were warriors. Jai Yaedeng gritted his teeth and closed his eyes, frowning. Jai Yaedeng and Dada Jio ran towards the city gate, and the man shouted that they needed help in the city. From the darkness between the trees, red lights were visible, and a voice was heard asking the man if he was the same as them. Sidu Liu lay on the ground with her eyes closed, blood running down her forehead as the demon asked if Aang was human. He stood in front of the guy who was emanating red energy, asking Aang a rank 1 demon, or is he even stronger and why did he grow a fin? The main character frowned, his yellow eyes were glowing. His face was pale and parts of it were red. He pursed his lips as the demon shouted that this couldn't be happening. The guy clenched his teeth and raised his finger, above which a beam of green energy appeared. He said that perhaps this was the goal of his rebirth, gaining this demonic power. Aang sent a green beam of light back, snapping his fingers and saying that this was necessary in order to change everything later. A green beam of light flew towards Sidu Liu, hovering over the girl, illuminating her face with green light. Green energy swirled around her as the girl lay on the ground with her eyes closed. White pluses emanated from the green energy. The spikes in the girl's shoulders dissolved. The demon opened his mouth, looking at this, and asked how he was treating her and where he got the green core from. The main character looked down, touching the core in his chest, remembering King Kai. When he appeared in the cave, the guy said that he doesn't remember well what happened then, and maybe it's because he absorbed that first-rank demon. Thick vines gathered around Aang, surrounding him as he stood in front of the demon, saying that if he swallowed it, he would become the owner of the power of water bonds. The vines summoned by the guy flew up. The demon stood in front of them, looking up and fearfully asked where such power came from and he had never seen. Aang stood on top of a large throne made up of vines, his arms outstretched, his red eyes glowing. The main character smiled as he looked down at the demon and said that he couldn't wait to see what the demon's power was in action. The demon looked tremblingly at the guy who stood above and said that he had absorbed the tree core of a first-rank demon and became one of them. Aang looked at him. In one of his eyes the white of the eye turned black and smiling. The guy thought it was interesting, and in his entire life he had never seen a demon so scared. Red energy emanated from the main character. He cast a shadow on the demon who was trembling standing in front of him. One of the loss hit the guy on the leg and latched onto him. He jumped down towards the demon as red energy emanated from him and the vine trailed behind him. Aang looked into his face smiling and told him to hit with all his might. He said he wanted to test how strong he was in this form. The demon raised his hand, drops of water gathering around it as he loudly asked who Aang was after all. The demon threw a sharp punch but hit the vine. Aang jumped above him as the demon screamed whether he was human or demon. The main character landed on the ground, leaning on it with his hand. A red light emanated from his eyes and the core on his chest, and he asked about controlling the elements. The guy extended his hand towards the demon, who staggered back. He said that he remembers that the tree demon he absorbed could do this. Aang clenched his hand, which had a faint green light glowing around it. Many vines grew from the ground, surrounding the blue demon and knocking him down. The stones nearby scattered. Vines wrapped around the body of the blue demon, who opened his mouth in surprise. They squeezed his arms and legs and the demon's body arched as the vines pulled on him. Aang frowned, his eyes glowing red and green light emanating from his entire body. He crossed his arms, clenching them into fists. The main character smiled, holding his hands in front of him and said that it looks like it's not that difficult. The demon trembled, stretching his hand forward as the vines wrapped around him and screamed that the protagonist was strangling him. The vines enveloped the demon as he hung above the ground and screamed. Aang's hand trembled. He said let the demon resist. Drops of water appeared under the vines that wrapped around the demon's chest, and he muttered that he could still use the trick. Skill. Splitting. 4 large projectiles from the water flew towards the main character. He frowned, looking at them silently. Aang jumped back and they crashed into the ground next to him, breaking through it and throwing rocks to the sides. A demon jumped towards the main character, opening his mouth and swinging his hand. His body was gathering from the water, and he shouted that the guy wouldn't wait. The demon threw a blow with his hand, but the main character blocked it with his hand. The demon shouted that he would not kill him just like that. The demon grabbed Aang's wrist with his paw, saying that his tree vines could not bind him and his body might split. The demon sharply pulled the guy's hand, tearing it away from his body. He struck the guy with his second hand, while Aang fought them off, leaving a red light behind the swings. The demon shouted that he had an incomprehensible power, the power of a demon. The demon kicked the main character in the chest, spread his arms to the sides, and shouted loudly that he was stronger. Aang flew back, knocking down the trees behind him, causing them to fall and branches to break. The main character smiled, letting out a quiet sigh. He flew backwards, arms outstretched, branches breaking around him, flying in all directions. He landed on the top of one of the trees that grew out of the ground. Aang stood on the ground. He was surrounded by red energy and lowered his head, saying that the demon is right. And he really doesn't understand yet how well he can control the demonic power. The main character smiled, his yellow eye glowing as he said that he was the strongest warrior, and his learning abilities were incredible. Near the guy's shoulder, green energy shone brightly, around which vines gathered. He said that if he wanted to kill the demon, he just needed to continue training to use demonic power. Instead of Aang's severed arm, he had an arm made of vines, inside of which green energy emanated. His red eye glowed. Behind him was a first-rank demon, whom he fought for the first time and who also grew his own arm. The demon looked at the guy in shock, shouting that these were vines and they restored themselves, and just like that. The guy smiled, clenching his hand into a fist. His hand became ordinary and normal. He said, "Let the demon take a look at how quickly he learns." Aang slammed his foot down on the ground, breaking the rocks. He leaned on the ground and tilted his body, preparing to jump forward. With great speed, the guy jumped forward, quickly flying towards the demon, his golden eyes casting light behind him. The demon stood looking at him while the guy ran between the trees in his direction. A vine grew out of the ground under the guy's sneakers, scattering stones. She pushed him forward, helping him move faster. Many vines grew from the ground, from which Aang pushed away and quickly ran towards the demon. He appeared next to him, illuminated by a red light, and the demon cried out in surprise. The demon turned his head to the side. There was only a dark mist in front of his face. He looked down to where one of his legs was captured by the vines that came out of the ground and screamed that he was entangled. Aang held the demon's head between his hands, around which green threads of energy circled. He squeezed the demon's head in his hands. His demonic fingers with claws entered inside the demon's head, and the demon screamed in fear. Smiling, the protagonist exhaled, looking at the demon while his eyes glowed brightly, and told him that he would not run away. The vines, which had stones on top, again grew from the ground under the protagonist's feet, lifting him up. He stepped on the rocks that lay on top of the vines, towering over the demon, who was down on one knee. Smiling, Aang said that he thought that their battle with him was very interesting. Green and red energy emanated from his fingers. The demon's throat began to swell, turning green. Veins appeared on it, and the demon screamed in fear that something was wrong with his body. He threw his head up. His hands were also swollen. Rays of green energy were visible from his body, and the demon screamed loudly while the guy continued to hold his hands on his head, lowering his head. There was a strong green explosion. Drops of water and stones flew away from it. Aang stood on the ground. Pieces of a dead demon were flying next to him. The guy's body was surrounded by red energy, and he lowered his head low. Behind him was a blue piece of demon flesh with a blue crystal sticking out of it. A blue core with a sign with drops of water circling around it. The blue demon smiled widely and pointed his spike at the guy's back, laughing and shouting that he was stupid and he could split himself all apart. Before he could strike, the blue demon was pierced by many spikes that came out of the ground. Aang stood with his back to him. The main character looked over his shoulder, frowned, and said that of course he knew this, but since he was a demon, his core could not split. The guy was lifted up by many vines. While he lowered his head, at the top of the vines that pierced the demon's body, there was a blue core. He said how stupid the demon is and how can he overestimate his strength so much. The demon reached for his core, trying to take it away, and said that it was his. Aang placed his hand on the core as the demon extended his clawed paw towards it, faintly saying that the core was his. The guy brought it to him, his face hidden in shadow, as he said that when the core collapses, even if he was a rank 7 demon, he would die. The main character smiled evilly. Looking down at the demon, his face was illuminated by the blue light from the core. He said that he would absorb the water-bond demon's ability. The demon's body leaned back, hanging on the vines, while the guy stood over him, smiling and clutching the core in his hands. Drops of water dripped from the dead demon's skull as it dissolved. Drops of water flowed down the vines, falling to the ground. All that was left of the demon was a puddle that lay near the vines. Aang stood between the vines, holding the cannonball above him, the red moon shining brightly in the sky. He squeezed the core in his demonic hand and it cracked, water leaking from inside. Smiling widely and opening his mouth, the guy drank the water from the core while his eyes glowed brightly with red light, and he laughed loudly, shouting that he was getting stronger. The demon's thoughts filled Aang's mind. Smiling evilly, the guy wiped his mouth with his finger, his body lighting up with blue energy as he said that it tasted good. He turned around, looking at the green dome that surrounded Sidu Liu lying on the ground. The girl lay with her eyes closed as a green healing dome surrounded her. The main character dissolved, turning into streams of water that flew closer to Sidu Liu. His body formed from the water near where Sidu Liu lay. He looked down at her as his body formed from the water, his golden eyes glowing. King Kai smiled, saying that he had dealt with the demons, and now they would take on her. The guy's face twisted when he said that he had absorbed the demon. Raising his hand high above himself, the main character smiled widely, his smile and one of his eyes glowing red as he said that the girl needed to be killed. The main character sharply lowered his hand, breaking the green dome that surrounded the girl. A red light emanated from his blow. Black blood splashes flew against a red background. Aang's demonic hand trembled over Sidu Liu, who was lying unconscious. The guy bit his lip. A drop of blood flowed from the wound, and a vein bulged on his cheek as he cursed. He stopped the demonic hand with his good hand. The demonic hand pierced it through 2 fingers and clenched his teeth. The guy told him to stop. He frowned deeply, trembling, his eyes glowing red as he asked how he could kill his own squad member. And he wouldn't even raise his hand to do such a thing. He had to deliver her back to the city. The guy complained about voices in his head. He lifted his head and placed his hand on it, his core glowing red and strong pulses rippling through the ground as he screamed for the demon to get out of his head. King Kai closed his eyes, his white hair flying in the air as he said that the guy was still resisting him. He smiled as the darkness covered his body and said it was interesting. Many fighters near the city walls fought with the horde of demons, cutting off their limbs, causing green blood to flow out of the demons' bodies. Several people stood on the city tower. Lan Sinuo and Suiju Yaohui stood with their backs to each other, surrounded by demons. The guy clenched his hand into a fist, which glowed with orange light, and said that the lower-ranking demons kept climbing and climbing. The guy clenched his teeth and raised his fist behind his back, his golden eyes shining brightly. He sharply hit the ground with his fist and the 3 demons flew away in different directions. An orange dome formed around the guy. The guy turned over his shoulder, frowning, and shouted why Aang and Sidu Liu were not here, and among all the troops they were the only ones who were not at full strength. Suiju Yaohui turned the dagger in her hand, closing her eyes. Behind her there was a huge demon with a blue cut on it. She said that when she arrived, she heard from others that 2 warriors secretly climbed out of the walls, and then they were dragged away by 2 first-rank demons. The girl put the dagger up and the demon planted its mouth on it. Green blood came out of its mouth, opening its eyes. Suiju Yaohui said that it seemed it was Aang and Sidu Liu, and she was so worried about them. The guy frowned and raised his hands, opening his mouth wide, asking what she said and asked again about getting out of the walls. The girl with pink hair put her hand to her forehead and closed her eyes, saying that he shouldn't ask her anything. And she knows that they were dragged away by first-rank demons, and she doesn't even want to think about it. Lan Sinuo put his elbow in front of him. A shield appeared in front of him, protecting himself from another demon. And he screamed, why did 2 first-rank demons suddenly appear? The guy and the girl ran towards the demon who was climbing the city wall, and Lan Sinuo said that first we need to deal with this wave of demons. Jai Yeadeng and Dada Jiao ran forward, the man's eyes glowing with golden light, and the girl's eyes glowing with red. The girl with red hair sharply kicked one of the demons. The captain ran further and punched the other demon. A red light emanated from their blows. Joel turned to them, his eyes glowing blue. He called to them, asking how they were doing with their core charges. Jai Yeadeng jumped high above the many demons who opened their mouths and raised his fist behind his back. He dealt a sharp blow to the center. Hitting one of the demons in the head, it exploded. Splashes of blood flew off from it. The arm of one of the demons was torn off. The demons spread out to the sides. The captain looked over his shoulder, frowning, and shouted that his charge was normal and that he and Dada Jiao had the same charge now. A girl with red hair ran along the ground. Bending her body, she thought that the cores that warriors use can wear out. And the stronger the explosion of the core, the more energy is wasted. And at the same time the attack power is less. She thought that it was good that he and Jai Yaedang had only fought one rank 1 demon, and the charge status of the cores was normal. Otherwise they would not have been able to help with the wave of demons. The girl kicked one of the demons, causing it to fly back, knocking down other demons standing behind. The girl stood in the middle of the field while the other 2 captains were fighting. She asked what Joel was up to. The guy with blue hair turned to look at the girl, frowning and shouting that they had already killed one first-rank demon, and these low-rank demons were much calmer. Besides, there were no first-rank demons left, and this pack of demons was not organized and was attacking without any strategy. 3 demons, red, blue and green, who grinned with their mouths. Joel shouted that lower-rank demons cannot think. 3 captains stood in the midst of a horde of demons, one of them trembling, looking at them, and the guy said that they feel fear of their death, and it is he who makes the demons afraid of them. The guy with blue hair smiled widely, while the other 2 captains stood behind him. Blue energy glowed around Joel, and he said that they would undermine their own desire to attack, and they need to buy time for the soldiers on the wall, and let them use the maximum charge of the cores, and they'll make fireworks of demons. The red cores on Dada Jio and Jai Yaedang's chests glowed with a bright red light, and she both replied that they understood. The 2 jumped high into the air, leaving behind white fog and a trail of red energy. The demons raised their heads up. The man and girl flew high into the sky, looking down at the ground. Jai Yaedang clenched his fist, frowning, saying that this is a herd of demons. The red-haired girl also looked down with a frown. They kicked off the air together and flew down, leaving behind a bright red light. Their eyes glowed, and the man said it was time to fry them. 2 bright red beams of light flew across the sky and circled in the sky as the demons looked at them. They landed sharply on the ground. Bright red lightning flashed around them, and the demons nearby were thrown away from them. Far from the city walls there was a huge crater, around which there was dark fog. 2 red figures with red cannonballs in their chests were visible in the fog. Dada Jio looked at the red dots in the fog, saying that considering that fight with the first-rank demon, this is the 2nd time today that she had to use a core explosion. Jai Yaedang next to her looked at the other, saying that if not for the limitation of power nuclei, then he would constantly destroy them like this. The 2 captains rested their feet on the ground, surrounded by red energy. Surrounded by a bright beam of light, the 2 of them headed forward towards the red dots in the fog. Joel stood in front of a horde of demons. Red energy pulses flashed in front of him, and the guy himself was surrounded by blue energy. He said that the explosion of the red core is still the most powerful. The guy flew forward sharply, over the crowd of demons, leaving 2 long blue beams of energy behind him. He smiled widely, his eyes glowing blue as he left many blue cuts with his daggers on the demons, whose blood splattered to the sides. Suiju Yaohui stood on the city wall, photographing below the 3 rays of light that the captains left behind, shouting that this is amazing, and this is the first time she has seen the captains fight like this. Such power. Lan Sinuo clenched his hands into fists, looking down, and thought that this is also the strength of a warrior, with a first-rank core, and he is overcome by envy, and he will also definitely become such a strong warrior. Joel exhaled noisily. He, Jai Yaedang and Dada Jio stood with their backs to each other. A dark fog was flying around them. The guy with blue hair asked if they were okay. Jai Yaedang replied that they were okay. The strain on the body was tolerable. The girl with red hair said that at least they finished them off quickly. The demon horde stayed away from the 3 captains who stood at the city gates. Joel looked at this with raised eyebrows and smiled faintly, beads of sweat running down his face as he told them to look at the herd of demons, and it seemed to work. And it was time to cheer up the warriors. The guy with blue hair turned to the city walls, raising his hands, and shouted to the warriors to catch their breath and continue to fight, and the wave of demons will surely retreat. Many fighters on the city wall smiled joyfully and clenched their hands into fists, agreeing and shouting that the 3rd captain could always be trusted. Joel closed his eyes and lowered his head, saying that this was great, but did not have time to finish. His eyes widened and turned red as he shouted to be careful, and something was coming. Dada Jio looked at the guy with blue hair in surprise, and Jai Yaedang turned back, looking to the side at the crowd of demons. The girl asked if this was the 2nd demon of the 1st rank. A figure was visible in the dark fog, with a red core in its chest. The 3 captains looked at her in shock, their eyes glowing brightly. The demons made way for Aang, who carried Sidu Liu in his arms as he walked forward. The guy's face was hidden in shadow. One of the captains called Aang. The demons bared their teeth and looked at the guy who was carrying the girl in his arms to the city walls. Dada Gyo looked at this in surprise, frowning, saying that it was Aang and Sidu Liu. But what happened to the first rank demon? Joel looked at Aang in fear, gritting his teeth, and said that even though they had driven away the demons, Aang was still unsafe around the first rank demons, and he walked past them so carefree. But these demons might attack him in any moment. Opening their mouths wide, 3 demons jumped above the main character. The 3 captains rushed towards the guy who was jumped by a crowd of demons. Jai Yaedeng shouted at them not to dare. Aang stood on the ground as many dark demon paws reached towards him. The demon's paws moved closer to him as he lowered his head and held the girl in his arms. Turning around abruptly, the protagonist looked at them with a dark gaze, red energy circling around him as he told them to go away. Many demons, whose red eyes glowed, looked at the guy in shock. They immediately jumped away from him, the wind circling around Aang. Trembling, the huge red demon looked at the guy. He scratched the ground beneath him with a trembling paw, whining loudly. The red demon opened its mouth wide, from which its tongue stuck out, running back. The rest of the demons looked in surprise at the red demon who was running away. Many demons were running away from the city walls while Aang stood calmly between them. He lowered his head as the crowd of demons ran back. Jai Yaedeng stopped abruptly, looking at this in shock, the other 2 captains running behind him. He asked loudly. The wave of demons retreated. A horde of demons ran away from the city walls. One of the soldiers' girls looked down in surprise while standing on the city wall, telling them to wait. Many soldiers raised their hands in the air, smiling happily and shouting that the wave of demons had retreated and they had won. One of the fighters, with black short hair, turned to the other, frowning and saying that how they retreated so suddenly. And was it really possible that the powerful maneuver performed by the 3 captains frightened these creatures so much? The other replied that apparently it was. Jai Yaedeng silently turned back while the soldiers from the city walls shouted that the explosion that the captains caused was a cool restraining maneuver. Others shouted that the captains were so strong and they were indebted to them. The man looked at the other 2 captains. The red-haired girl looked at him, and Joel put his hand to his chin. Jai Yaedeng wondered if it was because of them. His eyes widened as he turned forward towards the guy, looking at him in fear, thinking maybe it was because of Aang. He looked at the guy who was holding Sidu Liu in his arms and behind whom the demons were running away. The main character exhaled loudly and raised his head. He suddenly fell to his knees, throwing his head up and dropping Sidu Liu. Jai Yaedeng's eyes widened and he frowned. The 3 captains loudly called out to Aang, who fell to the ground, stretching out his arms and dropping the girl to the ground. All 3 captains ran towards Aang, whose eyes were closing, and Jai Yaedeng shouted that they would help them first and talk about the rest when they returned. Aang lay on his back, on a huge skull with 1 horn, which floated in the dark Red Sea. Someone said that he had tasted its relics. The guy looked up with a dull look, raised 1 eyebrow and asked who he was. Above him there was a dark sky with a few stars, and a voice said that they had already met half a century ago, and he should still remember it. The guy remembered the 2 demons that flew above him before his death and said about a demon of the 8th rank, and that one of the demons of the 8th rank, that he saw it was him, and how many of them there are. The voice told him not to worry about it and he would understand everything later. The main character's eyes widened. He turned his head and looked at King Kai, who was sitting next to him with his head bowed. The demon smiled, looking down at the guy and said that let him make himself comfortable. His name is Kai, and he is the Demon King, the strongest demon of the 8th rank. Aang looked at him in shock, his eyes widening in surprise. The demon smiled, thinking that since the guy had not yet run away in panic, his mind was strong enough to resist his suggestion, and he expected something similar from the strongest warrior. The king said that he should not worry, and since he could not harm him, Aang sat up on the ground, angrily looking at the demon, asking why he chose him, and what ultimately happens to his body. King Kai put his hand to his forehead, closing 1 eye and said that he was so noisy. A red demonic hand touched a finger to the cheek of the guy behind him, and he looked at her in fear. Another body of King Kai clasped the guy's head with his hand, placing the other on his chest. He lifted his head towards himself and, sitting behind him with a smile, told him not to worry and he would soon find out about everything. The demon ran his claw across the guy's chest, leaving streaks of red blood, and said that the guy's body also belonged to him, and due to some circumstances he might be in a state of sleep for some time. King Kai leaned towards the guy's face with a smile, running his hand down his chest, while Aang raised his head looking at him. The demon said that for their safety, he needs to work hard and evolve. The Kai King's body behind the guy dissipated, leaving red streaks of light, and the main character looked at the demon who was now standing in front of him. The demon extended his hand, beckoning the guy with his finger. With a smile, he furrowed his eyebrows, lights of different colors flickering around him as he said that he would then become completely untouchable. Aang rose from the ground, resting his hands on the ground and lowered his head, saying that they were demons. A terrible opinion about them, people. The guy put his hand behind his back, his eyes glowing red as he screamed that he would kill him. Someone told Aang to calm down. The guy opened one eye wide, standing in white clothes and holding someone by the clothes, raising his hand. He looked in surprise at Sidu Liu, who turned back. The guy was holding her clothes while Suiju Yaohui and Lan Sinuo stood nearby. Aang looked at the girl's chest, which was covered with a red and white stop sign. He held her clothes, thinking how blinding she was. The protagonist's eyes widened as he looked down, beads of sweat running down his face, and his face scrunched up as he thought about what he was doing. A bright flash of light flashed. Sidu Liu blushed, clenched her teeth and buttoned her white shirt, asking the guy if he was immortal. Three guys held Aang's arms and legs, saying that he had so much impudence, and that if he saved her, then it was still unforgivable, and that how dare he treat her like this. Lan Sinuo awkwardly stood by, scratching the back of his head while Suiju Yaohui took pictures of everything. Someone asked what the noise was and Sidu Liu turned around in surprise, raising her eyebrows. A man dressed in white clothes and with gray hair and beard walked into the room, with Jai Yeadeng, Dada Jiao and Joel standing behind him. Three people in white clothes bowed, calling the man master. A girl with white clothes stood in the center of the room with her hands folded and also bowed, calling the man father. Aang lay at the feet of the employees in white clothes, looking at the man in surprise and realized that it was Sidu Liu's father. He looked at a man with gray hair and blue eyes who stood with a calm face. Joel pointed at the man with his hand and lowered his gaze, saying that everyone in Helios City knows about the Sidu martial arts clan. And this is Sidu Shingon. And Aang is from here, how can he not know about such people? Aang looked at the man with raised eyebrows and thought that this was his teammate's father, and it looked like they were taking care of him the whole time during his coma. The guy walked up to Sidu Shingon, folded his hands and bowed to him, closing his eyes. He said that he was glad that he could see him, and thank you for everything he did for him, asking forgiveness for his tactlessness. The man looked at the main character. Sidu Shingon turned to the guy, smiling and spreading his arms to the sides. The man laughed. He wasn't worried about the matter. He put his hand on the main character's shoulder, and with a smile looking down at him, said that he saved his daughter's life, thanked the guy for his courage on behalf of their entire Sidu clan. The man turned to Jai Yeadeng, telling him that today everyone can rest and gain strength in the estate, and then they will celebrate the victory over the wave of demons. The three captains bowed to the man and said that they did not want to strain him. Sidu Shingon pointed his hand at Sidu Liu with a smile, saying that he raised the three of them, and by saying this, he lets him know that the Sidu estate is like someone else's home for them. He said that at the same time, they still represent the opportunity for Sidu Liu to create for them problems, and she was born to be a thorn, and they are punished for it. They should discipline her more, without leniency. Jai Yeadeng looked at the man seriously, telling him not to worry, and they would handle it. Sidu Liu looked at them, frowned and cursed. The captain looked at Aang, saying that he was asking everyone to leave except him. The guy looked at him questioningly. The three captains looked at the guy, who was sitting on a wooden bench. Jai Yeadeng frowned at him and said that a rank 1 demon had appeared in his warrior exam, and the recent wave of demons, that he knew about it. Joel turned to the man, his face hidden in shadow. He said that they could not delay this, and even if it was his squad. The guy with blue hair calmly looked to the side, saying that now he, the main character, looked at him in surprise when Joel said that he would ask directly. The energy was shining brightly around the three captains, red around Jai Yeadeng and Dada Jiao, and blue around Joel. A man with blue hair asked the main character if he was a demon.